for me, right? The presentation.
Yep.
Okay. Let me just fix my camera real quick. Oh, I just might join it from a different device then, so I can use my camera. Just give me a moment. All right, I think that works now. Am I visible on the other end? Just to confirm. All right. So with that, hi, I'm Largo. I'll be making a presentation about Matterloading, which is, I think, to many people, probably one of the unfortunate facts of debating, which is that we have to debate with facts and not just pure debating. I think that a lot of people have their own preconceptions about what Matterloading should be. And I'm not gonna dispel all of them. I'm just gonna give my own insight, standing on the shoulders of giants before me have talked about the topic, what I can also add on to it. So next slide. Okay, so a disclaimer. So none of the stuff that I'm going to say here is particularly revolutionary. A lot of it is already mentioned probably by many of your coaches, if not coaches already exist online on workshops. But I think what I can add here is a lot of grounding to what I think a person who is in high school or going into collegiate debating later on, what they can do as simple habits rather than the sort of very rigorous stuff that gets drilled into us and what we think matter loading should be. So a lot of matter loading, I think for me, probably like 70-80% of it is stuff that you can do on the commute, while going home, doing your laundry, etc. And a lot of that is important. A lot of that is what keeps you updated. So a lot of this has already been said. I just would want to, ground it within the what is most relevant, I think, for your context as debaters. Next slide, please. All right. So the outline of my presentation goes as follows. Firstly, just being honest about what matter loading is. Secondly, easy and hard matter loading, these terms that I got from Miko, which is basically, I'm going to explain it later, but a lot of it is already stuff that you know, just structured. Fourthly, how do you use matter? So what is an effective way in which you can use matter within debates? And last, on how often should you matter load at all? So next slide, please. All right, just being honest, right? I think next slide, please. Yeah, so matter loading is one of probably four things for you. It's one, for a lot of people, it's probably boring. And that I think this is a little bit unavoidable given that we are used to, in our free time engaging in, YouTube, video games, etc. So to think about spending 1 hour of your very probably hectic schedule doing matter loading seems initially very boring. It can also be confusing where to start. So there's a lot of conflicting sources, a lot of sources that um, have long form content. A lot of them, tackle particular topics with different levels of nuance or biases, and it's hard to know where specifically is the best path to leap from to understand a specific topic. It's also tiring because you devote a lot of time to it, and it's also a mental effort to juggle all these facts in mind, to use them within debates. And I think one thing that many people don't talk about is that it's often dubious. So I say this because I think I've experienced so many times when I was a high school debater where I simply felt that I knew a lot more matter than another team, but it didn't reward me in the way in which I expected it to reward me, like giving me the win. I ended up saying a bunch of facts, but it didn't land, or I just don't know how to apply it in that debate. So it ends up being dubious as to what value it can give you within the debate round or within debate in general. But all of these things can be dealt with mostly through a proper mindset, discipline, and hard work. The last part is very crucial because, as many things are, it gets easier the longer you get at it, right? A lot of it is habits that you build, as what Claire says at the start of the workshop. A lot of it is something that you develop over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so where do we start with tackling the issue of matter loading? I think there are two broad distinctions, and I credit Miko a lot for this because he gave me the terminology for what I was thinking of when we were talking for how I would organize this presentation, which is basically matter loading can be divided into two main things or two main approaches. Both of these work in tandem with each other, which is firstly easy matter loading, which I'm going to describe later on, is a lot of matter loading that you do in a daily sense, in a very soft, regular sense. And later on, I'll talk about hard matter loading briefly, which is a lot of the specific rigorous matter loading that is needed for getting depth in certain topics or just building certain sort of theoretical understanding about certain things. But before that, just easy matter loading, stuff you already know, but a lot more nuance probably to it. Next slide, please. All right. So I think there are broadly 4 tips I can give for easy matter loading. So this is stuff that you can expect to do 80% of the time when you're doing matter loading. What you consider to be matter loading, it is something that you do every single day, probably. It is something that you can do when just have 5 to 10 minutes to read an article, etc. I think there are 2 things just initially to talk about like easy matter loading in this aspect. I think the first and most critical for me in terms of easy matter loading and the way in which I keep updated about news as a collegiate debater right now is that you use a lot of your idle time to matter load. Because people often tend to view them and compartmentalize matter loading as a separate activity that is done separately from other things in your life. So it's like 1 hour, lock yourself in a room, you finish that case file, you finish whatever it is you wanted to research on. But the problem with that is that we don't have that magical hour most weeks. We don't have that time that we can devote specifically for debate. And even if we do, it's hard to get that specific hour of focus time, which I'm going to talk about later on. Maybe we don't have the motivation, or maybe it's just an off season, we might not want to do it. I think it's crucial that you view matter loading as something that adds on to your life. So whenever you're doing, for example, chores, laundry, exercising, in my case, a lot of it is chores and laundry because I'm a college student. I have to do a lot of these things in my daily routine, etc. Probably like 2 hours every single day, something like that. You make it fun by you doing it at the same time as you do other things. So this is just a sort of comparison, right? So let's say you get like a wagyu steak, or you get a wagyu steak, and then you get a vegetable right next to each other. The wagyu is obviously good. It just gets much better if you place it right next to a vegetable. So when you're doing matter loading, right, and it's initially boring, if you're doing other stuff that's also boring, then by comparison, it just looks better and it is more palatable to you, especially when it's a lot of time that you think is wasted time doing other things that you just don't think are constructive, a waste of time, or things forced to you by your parents, etc. You can make it fun. What I do is I listen to podcasts. A lot of these podcasts or a lot of these YouTube videos that I listen to are things that you can listen to give you short form explainers about what's going on in the world. A lot of these things can also be like relatively tuned out on, like from time to time, if you do need to do some work while doing laundry, etc. But in general, it allows you to be tuned in, but also at the same time do something that you need to do. The second thing it's incredibly important for essentially making matter loading work for you is make social media do a lot of the work. And so I say this because the algorithms that we have on stuff like Facebook, YouTube, etc., are so incredibly intelligent. Like, you know how much information they probably get from you. They can tailor your feed incredibly well. But the problem is that a lot of people tend to uh, sort of not use this to their advantage. They think that matter loading is like just going to the New York Times or the Economist, and then they leave social media or Facebook just completely separate. But the problem is that you will probably spend a lot of time on social media or Facebook or Twitter or all of these things. And a lot of that time is stuff that's not time that's not constructive, I guess, towards the field of debating. And so obviously it's a disclaimer, not everything needs to be constructive to debating. But if you wanted to add a little bit of, for example, things to on your social media feed that informs you every single day, you can do things such as, follow particular academics, follow politicians on your Twitter feed that I think are important people you get important takes from about the world. On YouTube, it's a lot of it is just subscribing to informative news channels and, watching them from time to time so that the algorithm plays to your advantage and recommends more of those videos to you. On Facebook, a lot of it is favoriting important Facebook feeds, like from news pages, etc. And even if you don't want this to be overwhelming your social media feed, oftentimes these social media algorithms tend to hit the balance naturally anyways, where you're shown some of these at the start of your feed, then later on it's the rest of your friends or whatever memes you want to look at on social media. A lot of that is already something the algorithm knows to balance you out. It needs to show. So these things happen when you make a concerted effort towards tailoring your feeds to your advantage specifically. Next slide, please. All right. The third is also quite important, which is pick your content well. And I think this is just nuance to realism because a lot of people will say you should just you should read foreign affairs every single day, or you should read the latest, I don't know, like you should read in the famous words of like the average serious posting person, read the Economist cover to cover, and you expect to do that every single time, right? But the problem is our brains are probably really fried. It's not only because of social media in general that fry our brains, like the subway surfer stuff, but also in general, probably because we're tired and we don't really want to engage with like, that much content every single day. So you probably have to pick content that works for you and to have an active step in that process. So think about what content is stuff that you want to see, is stuff that you want to watch. So an example of this is that I used to really struggle a lot with researching about international relations. I had to, before I forced myself to watch a lot of like documentaries about what's really going on, a lot of that during my downtime. And it eventually created a quite difficult experience with debating because I felt that this was all I had that I had to do this all the time, where I had to watch all of these practically boring documentaries. Even if they were entertaining, it's just the thought that I had to watch an hour of these content, etc., every single time I wanted a matter load, made it hard for me to view matter loading as fun. But lately, I've been attracted to more short form video content. So a lot of stuff like TLDR, like Wendover. I mean, not necessarily Wendover. A lot of these short form media content that show specific like highlights of what's going on in the world, topics that you want to care about. How Money Works is also a good example of that. It's quite fun. Talking about like, the important topics to debate. So you have to be nuanced with what you can accomplish and what you can, take in information for yourself, especially because you have so little time in the day. And the last thing to talk about in terms of easy matter loading, the sort of matter loading you can do every once in a while, is just use it, right? So people tend to keep matter loading as a very private experience sometimes. I just don't understand that. Because if you have so much knowledge about the world and you can add that to your daily conversations, don't like obviously don't do it like very weirdly. Say, oh, you want to talk about the socio-political state of the world right now. But you might want to enrich some of your conversations with, certain things that you know about the world, or go to class, for example, and mention certain things that you know about the current political situations around the world. This happens especially in a lot of the more advanced classes you'll take later on. Or simply put, test yourself once in a while. There's a lot of really good matter quizzes from certain news websites. I believe it's the New York Times, especially, that is one that's been recommended to me. I never really got into taking these things, but I think they're every week, if I'm not mistaken. They're every week. You can take a matter quiz on what's going on within the world, and you can reward yourself. Oh, I got that right. So I've been reading, I've been researching, and that's rewarding as an experience for you, right? You can also, and I think this is quite important. Practice explaining stuff simply to people. So whenever you watch YouTube video, right? And then you see a chance to talk about that. Don't talk about it with all of the depth of particularities within that conversation, because you're probably just gonna weird out the person you're talking to, or at best they won't care too deeply about it. I think a lot of debating is explaining things in a way that makes sense to people by using a lot of nuance from deeper understanding of topics. So the smarter you are, the simpler your explanation, stuff like that, right? And I think it's really helpful, especially when you're building frames in debate later on, to practice explaining what's going on, and maybe like this is like a extreme case, like Israel Palestine currently, what's happening in the Russia Ukraine war, what's happening in US politics right now to an average person, and explaining why these things are also important to them. Why is it important for you as a high school student to know about these things? Why is it important for a Filipino person to care about what's happening in the West Philippine Sea? And you can just practice how you explain these things, and it's so constructive in debate. It really is a lot of benefit that you get later on, especially when you're trying to explain these things to a judge that has to assume a more average, reasonable stance most of the time. So that's the four things I would recommend in terms of easy matter loading. So the general matter loading that you do. Next slide, please. All right. But it's just unavoidable, I think, especially if you need to have a lot of spec important matter about certain things, or you just want to go in depth about a particular topic, or you're a very beginner debater and you want to get some of the fundamentals down, some of the things that you need to know first before you can enter, like the pieces of the game, of the game you're playing before you can play it, right? You have to do hard matter loading at once in a while. So probably this is around 20% of the time that you spend matter loading. 20% of your focus as well. But it's quite important, especially because this is often the stuff that you bring as case files within to tournaments. So those, if you're not familiar with the terminology, it's those like paper compilations of notes of people, uh, of what's going on in the world, their own notes about what's going on in the world, or stuff like primers for how to tackle specific topics or themes within debate. All of these things relate to hard matter loading. And it's important. It's definitely very, very important in the lead up to a major competition that you're doing. But as I'll highlight later on, it doesn't have to be the be all end all. It can definitely be made a lot easier to do. So next slide, please. So how do you engage with what is essentially a montage of matter loading? These particular like 1 or 2 weeks before the competition moments where you have to really focus work a lot of matter loading. I think the first important thing that you need to do, especially as a high school debater, or I would suggest to do, is to prioritize researching into theory and structures of things rather than specific cases of things. So the example of this is when you're looking at or trying to understand what the ASEAN does, right? It's not probably constructive for you if you have limited time in your focused matter loading session to research about how ASEAN, like the recent case of ASEAN, of how the particular how they particularly intervened in this one case in this one Southeast Asian nation like 2 months ago. It's important for keeping up to date, and ideally you have some idea of these things as well. But if you have limited time and you know that some ASEAN motion is probably going to come out, or some ASEAN topic is going to be discussed, or ASEAN adjacent topic, it's probably more important to talk about or to research how these institutions work. So what are the processes within the ASEAN? What are the processes within the International Court of Justice, for example? What are the different institutions within the European Union that all work together and all sort of serve a purpose? And so a lot of this can be boiled down to essentially dividing something importantly, which is what the second thing is here. But more specifically, dividing large topics into things that are manageable, and just also getting a more top-down perspective first is also important. And another thing here is on first principles. And a lot of first principles is basically like the first things that you need to do, or the first assumptions you need to make or to know before you can argue more complex cases. So the most common example of like first principles compile is probably that Monash document. I'll link it if I have it later. From I forgot his name. I think probably David knows this guy. But yeah, so the first principles are essentially the things that you need to know before, are things that you can apply in pretty much every debate related to a particular theme. What is important here is to not just rely on first principles right by other people, but whenever you're, for example, after a debate, and you have your notes, for example, about that particular debate, it's probably important and probably very constructive for you to spend some time in your focus matter loading session, seeing what are similarities between different debates of the same topic, different characterizations you can reuse yourself that you really like, things that you can make more nuanced by adding a little bit more sort of your own introspection and your own engagement with the topic, and developing your own first principles, but developing your own way of tackling a specific theme. So the example of this is like, for me, most importantly, was dealing with finance. It was very hard for me to deal with finance as a topic because it's quite scary. Um, a lot of it is veiled in jargon. A lot of it is like that. A lot of it is overwhelming. But once you see the very common arguments that come out, you watch like particular debates over and over again. You've debated the specific kind of topic or theme over and over again. And most importantly, you think about common characterizations or first principles you can apply for different kind of debates. It eventually becomes sort of standard practice for you to not approach it from a place of fear, but you just know what to do initially, right? Yeah. Um, Lastly, I think importantly, matter is to simplify and not to complicate. So whenever you're case filing, it's probably not constructive to spend like 5 hours copy pasting articles into a Google Docs and printing it. Because let's be real, you have 15 minutes during a debate competition to in prep to flip through a case file. If it's 100 pages, how realistic is it that you'll get all of the most important nuggets of wisdom to develop your case within that 15 minutes? A lot of matter, I think, is important to the extent that you can simplify it and use it for your own debates that you do. Summaries of particular topics, the tidbits that you could use within debates. It's also quite important as well to, when you think about a particular topic, you read about it, to try to simplify it, in, as I mentioned earlier, in a way in which is comprehensible to an average person. So debates sometimes might reward you for like sounding very smart, having very deep details on a particular topic. But most often you don't have the time to do that, and it's probably very boring and probably doesn't land most of the time. So it might be more helpful for you to approach it from the place of simplifying what you research about rather than complicating it. Next slide, please. All right. So now what? What is the takeaway from this? And here's just a very like just in general like fact, I think, for most people, which is you could probably beat your history teacher in a debate. This is just a random thing I could probably like say, right? Like your history teacher debating in BP debate, you would probably win against them. And that's just the way it is, right? Because they probably don't know the format, etc. But that doesn't mean that that person can't or doesn't outmatter you significantly in historical information or knowledge about the world or whatever. It doesn't mean that that person isn't intelligent, doesn't have a lot of well-read takes on specific topics within the world. But within debate, you'd probably still win against them because you have more knowledge about how to do, engage specifically with different positions within BP debate. So what's the takeaway from here? I think it's important that you just don't have information. You just know how to use it. What is the most efficient way of using matter? Most effective way of getting it to land to a judge that you have to assume is an average reasonable voter? Because it's not enough for you to be the smartest person. You have to also be the best debater in that debate to win, if you care about winning. So that's one thing you need to care about. How do you use matter? So our next slide, please. How do you use matter? And I think it's important that you firstly, practice using your case file. I've seen this so often. There are like people that bring like a 100-page case file, but they've never touched it. They've never read, like they've never tried reading it during a competition before that major competition that they go to. They've never tried using like these specific things, like flipping through it and like having that particular nuance within like certain themes, etc. They just bring it around and it ends up becoming like a weight in your backpack rather than an actual important thing. It becomes an accessory that you like show to other people. Like I researched a lot about this particular topic, but when push comes to shove, it's not useful. I think what's important is that you practice using your case file. So like flipping through it in prep rounds that you do with your partner is important before a competition. If you think that certain motions are incredibly complicated for you right now, you can't argue it immediately, and you need to use a case file that you've prepared, you practice using it. Don't just bring it around in the competition and you don't know how to use it. But what's also important here in the flip side is that you have to know when to cut your losses. So 15 minutes in prep is probably not enough to have the most nuanced case. Sometimes you have to, after like 2 minutes or 3 minutes of reading your case file, to know the particularities of a topic that you researched on, but are tackling in the debate and need a little bit more nuance in, to cut your losses. Like you can't spend all of your time looking at your matter file, looking at your case file during the competition, because you will lose nuance. You will lose the ability to make a debate speech if you spend a lot of the time just reading your thing. So you have to know when to cut your losses and know which nuance or how much nuance is enough for you to argue specifically, effectively, and importantly, what you need to argue. Secondly, I think is important here, you use your matter to illustrate and not to assert. And people do this a lot, which is they say a certain example, another team then counter asserts an example. And so a judge at the end of the debate is like, which example, if both of these are real, is true? Which both of these are important? I think that arguing by example is a tendency that happens when we initially feel very excited about knowing a specific theme, like comprehensively. Like if you research a lot about uh, sort of artificial intelligence, right? It's tempting to argue by example. It's tempting to say that these things mean that there is no debate anymore and that we've already won. But this often isn't effective because the judge can't search on Google whether or not you're true or not. They have to believe that your argument is true first. And importantly, a good example, an intuitive, simple example, strengthens the argument that you make and makes it more believable. But you can't just argue by example because it's just hard to credit it. It's hard to view whether it's even real because a lot of people tend to unfortunately lie in debate. So you have to use good examples to strengthen arguments and not just use it as an argument in itself. And lastly is matter is to simplify and not complicate. So this is different from the way in which you prepare your case file because it's about how you use it, right? So you want to sound like you're making sensible claims and you want to use matter to prove that that claim is sensible. Because a lot of set claims in debate, even though they are true, are simply not sensible for the average person or as intuitive for the average person. So what you can do is say, oh, this happened recently within the election, or this the lead into the election, and this particular nuance that we're introducing in our debate, in the debate as the closing theme, is important because of this example, because of all of these reasons, etc. So it's not about you going into the debate and saying there's like 10 different things that the opening doesn't talk about, and here's why we talk about, and here's why we win. It's about finding and generating that analysis that is simple but effective, that comes only from a specific knowledge of the topic yourself. That happens when you have that sort of um, familiarity with how to engage with that topic that makes it simple. Because the best arguments are often quite simple. They are intuitive. They seem like prior to your own understanding of the topic. It's as if you had that knowledge yourself. So that's how you can use it, by making simple claims and not overly complicating it with 5 layers of different nuances that are dubious in their effectivity in getting your case across. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is how often you should matter load. So if you've been listening to the presentation so far, you probably know that first, it's probably a step-by-step process. So you have to form a regular habit of doing it. It's not just that you can only do it 2 days before the competition. I mean, some people do this. It works for them. It probably won't work for you on every instance, especially if, for example, before a competition, you have an exam or you have different problems with your schedule, etc. You have to do it step by step because it's the only way you can have it a consistent part of your routine, etc. But also just in general, block out focus time that you do it maybe once a week if you can. Lead up to competitions twice a week. Block specific hours of your time as well and focus in doing it. So close your social media. Tell whoever it is, your family members in your house, I'm spending this time matter loading. They'll probably care about it because like, it looks like you're studying. All of this stuff allows you to have it very focused and very, in particular, structured so you can do it effectively. Thirdly, I think is prioritize. So matter load. So the problem is that people think they should matter load every single day because they have to talk about all topics or have to be comfortable with all topics. But I think it's important that you have you understand your limitations of time and you prioritize what you matter load is what's relevant for the comp that you're going to. So if you're going to like a Philippine competition, nationals or whatever, probably research about what's going on in the Philippines. If you're going to a particular competition that's international or specific to a particular context, then search the context of the CAs of that competition. Search on the context of that school or whatever, or the country that you're going to. But also in general, focus on what you're weak first. So don't have the pressure of always, you know, doing master loading every single day to eventually one year like solo leveling your way to like absolute god level debater. You probably have to focus on your weaknesses first because you have limited time. You can't always do matter loading effectively every single day, even if you're just doing easy matter loading. So you have to focus on your weaknesses first because those are most likely to be exploited within a debate competition, most likely where you feel the most frustration in. And this is where you get the good feeling of the habit that you're doing, that you focus on researching about. In my case before, it was a lot about art, etc. I focused on researching about art first, and I spent some time, every once in a week thinking about that and researching that and compiling previous debates I had. And that's the most gains I got in debating from a short period of time that made me want to do more matter loading in a structured way. So you focus on your weaknesses first if you can, spend more time doing everything, which is realistic, I think. So focus on what you can do. And then lastly is just to insert some JJK quote because I think JJK is quite good. So you should be proud of yourself, right? I'm pretty sure a lot of debaters don't matter load, and I'm pretty sure a lot of them don't have the time or the discipline to do it. So just in general, attending a workshop about matter loading is quite important. And in general, once you start matter loading and keeping a regular habit of knowing what's going on in the world, you feel the benefits. You feel not only in debate, but also in general because you are kind of getting what the sport is imparting to you, which is, being a more well-read person, a more nuanced person about the world. So a lot of it is just appreciating that you are making this attempt to be more well-read. And it's not just in debate that it applies. It applies to a lot of things that are very important. Like if you're talking about your local communities, and you keep a regular habit of reading about Philippine news, what's happening within the current Marcos administration. That is important for talking about what is affecting your local communities. That's what is important for talking about what affects the Philippines and the broader global community. All of these things are important. And it's not just in debate that they're applied. You can apply it very much in debate, but it's something that you can be proud of yourself in saying, I've made the step in being more informed. And you have to be proud as well because come on, a lot of people make assertions and lies in debate, and you kind of have to be the good person here. As what Luigi Alcañez says, right? There's lots of evil in this world, so you might as well be the good person and actually do make research claims, make important informed claims, because those are the ones that are rewarded. You have to believe that they are rewarded because people are reasonable and people know also about the world. So you can be proud of yourself that you're making that step and learning about the world, etc. Next slide, please. I think it's a Q&A, if not mistaken. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, just briefly, I'm not going to talk about this because it's boring. So this is just a bunch of things that I compiled from a lot of different people in the lead up to this workshop. Certain important news sources that if you had to prioritize them, it's probably good. Headline news, I like the New York Times, I like Vox, I like NPR. But then this is here, The Economist is quite good, but don't always like read it. Crowd is quite good. I love in-depth politics stuff. Last Week Tonight is very, very accessible. It's very, very fun. Sometimes he's interesting, but you have to believe that it's entertaining. A lot of these are different IR politics channels on YouTube. There are people who are on Twitter or people on Facebook who have regular content there. You can engage with them, and they provide a lot of these are noticeably accessible content. They aren't very like third level of analysis content. So I think this would be helpful for you as a high school debater to engage with. Next slide, please. Just other stuff as well. I honestly don't recommend like a lot of like finance bro content, but there are some that are quite good. I like How Money Works because it's very, very accessible. Economics Explained has very interesting topic takes sometimes, but that's just how economics sort of education is. But in general, it's quite important. Other stuff as well, more specifically in finance. If you care a lot about it, then you can engage with it. Miscellaneous stuff, I really do love the School of Life. It talks about philosophy in a way that's accessible. I think that's quite good. Simon Clark, support that guy's channel. That guy is struggling right now, but I think recently there's been a lot of support for sort of climate change, environmental YouTube content. So I guess it's important. Just a shout out to like Luigi and Miko here for generally, and not they're not matter loading content, but if you want to learn about principles and theory in general, they're also quite, very accessible content for you as a debater. But you probably already know that. So this is just in general a brief run through of what I think are important sources that you could access as a, if you could access some that I think are not, they're very applicable to the context of an average debater. And yeah, so next slide, please. All right, so the shoulders of giants. This is just the people that I listed a lot in or people that I got a lot of insight from. Miko specifically, I had like a conversation with him about what is the most accessible way of teaching this to high school kids. But also other people that I think are quite important is this lecture from Sir DePaul, from Sarate, and Useful Habits by Luigi talks not just specifically about matter loading, but a lot of it is other stuff that you can, view in debating as, useful habits as well. Yeah. So yeah, um, that's it. That's it for my lecture. Then Q&A. Yeah.
Slay. Guys, if you wanna Q&A, you can either PM it directly to Jello, or if you guys are shy, you can send it to me here, and then I'll read it to him without saying your name.
If I had to be asked for what like qualitatively is the most important like channels to view or like news sources to prioritize, I probably couldn't give you an answer. But the gist of it is probably finding what works for you. So yeah. Okay. How often do you excuse yourself from family gatherings because you're matter loading? It's an interesting question. Um, a lot of it is like having your family support you when you're doing it, like matter loading specifically. So for example, you're going like a week before PSDC or whatever, and then you kind of have to not attend a family gathering to matter load or to spend time matter loading. I mean, most families probably like it that you're very engaged with the sport, you're trying to improve yourself. So just say why it's very important to you. And in general, it also is very important for your debating. They probably care about that, given that they spend money on your debating. So they want you to do better. So this is just a way to convince them. I think the bad habit is to not tell people that you're matter loading or you're devoting time towards, um, being more informed about things because it's a solitary road, right? Especially when it's sometimes boring, very routine-esque, etc. Okay. Thoughts on utilizing AI for matter loading. Do you have any healthy and useful routine on this method? So I am not the foremost AI expert in the world, and like I'm not sure what best AI to use, but I think it's been helpful for me whenever there's like a very inaccessible, for example, finance article, for me to go like chat GPT and like ask it to explain it to me in a very simple way. Often you want to do this yourself, so you read something and then you process it in a very simple way and say it to someone else in a very simple way. But if you just can't make sense of something, it's quite important to know the basics of that particular topic first, or to make it more accessible to you, because otherwise it's simply not useful for your life, etc. So it's been helpful for me to go on like ChatGPT or some other AI software, asking it explain this in a very like simple accessible way. And maybe you lose a little bit of nuance, that's okay, versus just completely dropping the article that you read because it just doesn't make sense. So yeah, should you make actual files specifically for matter loading, like purely information dump? Or is it better if you make case buildings that integrate matter that you have found? Make actual files specific for matter, but case buildings that integrate matter. This is actually a very good question. I think it's both. I think a lot of debate matter loading is evaluating cases that you have run or cases that you've prepped. And if you think that it loses a little bit of nuance in certain pieces of analysis, going back to it and adding info into it, adding stuff that you've learned from like a YouTube video, etc., into it, and then just it becomes a lot more complete case. And trust me when I tell you, a lot of debates are very similar. So you can trust that you will use that particular characterization that you've just made a lot more nuanced, a lot more effective because of matter loading in general, and then from your case build prior, then you can use that. But a lot of matter loading is also just information dumps. So a lot of it is just making primers about how to assess specific topics and themes. A lot of it is just making things that you can use and access within a tournament, etc. So it's a mix of both. I think case building is a wonderful habit to do with your partners, especially not just by yourself. And it really helps to add nuance if during the round that you're prepping, you didn't know what was going on in the motion. Like the motion's talking about some economics concept that you don't understand, interest rates or whatever. And you go afterwards, you research about it, then you add the nuance into that case that you built. And definitely is helpful for long-term growth. How do you matter load a topic that you have no prior knowledge of? Yeah, so this is the next question. How do you matter load a topic that you have no prior knowledge of at all? Like spec knowledge that has very specific jargons or terms. Um, for me, it's never been like you make an index of what specific things are, but like it's helpful, I guess, to um just have like the note specific terms that are like pop up quite often. So like in an example of this is like there's like a genre of debate that talks about businesses, and a lot of it businesses, the corporate world, and like IPOs and all of that stuff, stocks, stuff like that. So there's a lot of these particular terms that just pop up again and again. So it might be helpful for you when you're researching and you find a term that you don't know, to just like outline this term, see other debates that could use this term, and just internalize it, right? Also, the same example that I had earlier makes sense, which is try to explain things in a very simple way. Often, like a lot of like deep jargon is just very simple explanations, but condensed into one word. Like, no, this is not related to a specific topic, right? But there was a lot, like a period in time in my life where I struggled with understanding what the hell the word delta means. I don't understand what this word means. So I go on online, ask people about it. And then I realize it's not important at all. And it's just a different way of saying the change that happens within a debate or something like that, right? So you can just say it in a different way. You don't have to use specific jargon. Often is quite constructive to use simple terms rather than jargon. But if you do have to use jargon, just note these particular jargon that pop up very often, so that you know that these things, if someone else says like this word, you know what it means. If you have to use that word, you know how to use it effectively, and not just say words that you've read about but you don't know what the meaning is, because that can be quite destructive for a case. If you're making a reasonable case, it just makes you seem assertive or you don't know what you're talking about. So yeah. Any other questions? I think I'm currently at 42 minutes. Okay, Boss, what does delta mean? Very good question. I don't know what it means. Until this point, I'm I've had the habit of in debates where someone else says, "Oh, we have the better delta." I just say, "But I have the better delta." But I don't know what delta means. Honestly, I just don't know what it means. So it's not. I'm probably not the foremost expert in like a really advanced debate jargon or whatever. But sometimes you just don't have to use these stuff. Like you can just use simple terms. It's probably more effective to use simple terms rather than engaging specifically with like the words that other people use, etc. Like look at the teams that do really, really well. And when you watch a speech that they do, let's say you're watching it on a YouTube video, none of it is just like none of it is someone using the word highfalutin, or none of it is using those like very, very long words or whatever, right? A lot of it is simple explanations, very efficient wording. A lot of it is very efficient ways of explaining things in topics that you have to use jargon, you probably have to use it. But generally, I'll try to avoid using it because you're trying to explain it to the average person, a specific topic in the average person. This applies even in finance debates or even in economics debates because you have to assume the average person doesn't know too much about these things beyond headline covers of what's going on in like the markets right now, right? So practice explaining things with simple terms. If you have to use jargon, um, try to use the most common ones that come up in spec heavy debates. Yeah. So I think that's it. Uh, do we have time for another question, or is there another question?
You have 2 more minutes of answering questions.
All right. Oh, okay. So does anyone else have a question? Because like I think matter loading, this is a very condensed lecture. Honestly, I think that the wealth of knowledge that you can probably have or gain on matter loading on the internet or from your seniors is so big. Just just in general, the amount of times that I've asked someone about their perspective in matter loading, and it's so completely different. Some people, their perspective on matter loading is just watching YouTube videos. Some people, their perspective on matter loading is spending a lot of time studying matter every single like week or day as if it's a subject that they grind in their classes. It's like, damn, people have different approaches to it. So I guess different ways of different things you're curious about in matter loading is important, and I can answer that to some respect. But a lot of it is just discovering what works for you and what is important to you, uh, and what just honestly what gets you results, what gets you feeling like you've done something productive in matter loading, etc. So different approaches, different ways to do it. I think a pretty good approach is a sort of 80%, 20% division. I'm pretty sure there's a term for that. It's like Pareto principle or something like that, right? But not it's a different thing. But a lot of it is just balanced, right? A lot balanced approach to it, not being obsessive about it, not being too overly lax about it. But the way in which you do it is up to you. Um, does anyone else have a question? Because I think that's time. Yeah? No. Um, if no one else has a question, I think I can proceed or the proceed with the other lecture.
Slay. Okay, everyone say thank you, Jello. Please react there or send us a chat. Let's show Jello some love.
Thank
Um,
you, thank you, thank you. Yeah. If you have any questions, you can just PM me. I'll just stay in the call.
okay. So yeah, for the second lecture, y'all are gonna be learning about rhetoric and style. So let's all say hi, Ali.
Hi. So give me a second to share my screen. Um, and then let me make this full screen so that's not ugly. Present. Okay. So my name is Ali. I will be giving the lecture on style and rhetoric. I think it's interesting to have a lecture like this because when we think of things like style and rhetoric, we don't really think of them as things that we hone, or as hard skills like matter loading or like building analysis, right? While style is very important and rhetoric is very important, I think there can be times where it's a little bit daunting to understand how to develop style and rhetoric just because it's either like things like rhetoric, it's like it's hard to come up with bangers before the like motion is out, right? Or like jokes or whatever, or things with style that's like quite personal to you. And it depends a lot on just how you naturally speak. And changing a lot of those things about you. So I hope that this lecture is able to kind of simplify the concepts of style and rhetoric, and provide a little bit more of a framework when it comes to developing these skills in the future. So the first thing I'm going to go through is just an outline of what this lecture will cover. So the first is we're just going to define what is style and rhetoric. And I also want to get into some discussion about what they are not, or how not to use your style and rhetoric. The second is we're going to go into the elements of style and rhetoric, I suppose. How do we actually, sorry, that's like a typo. Ignore that. If you were here for the last lecture, I suppose you'd recognize this. Third, we will talk about what is good style. Fourth, we will talk about how do you develop style. And last, we will talk about how to use style to win debates. And then lastly, the Q&A. So first, let's talk about what is style and rhetoric first, just to get a definition of terms that we're all generally around the same place when discussing these for the rest of the lecture. So when we talk about style, it's basically how a message is delivered to the audience, taking into account who you are speaking to and for what you are speaking about. Typically debaters will have their own style, both with respect to just how they deal with debates, the mindsets they have with debates, as well as how they choose to come forward when, actually giving their speeches. And so I would describe style as like the overall vibe you have, right? Which consists of both verbal and non-verbal competencies. So verbal, in the sense of like the elements we'll talk about later, such as tone, intonation, etc. Non-verbal, such as body language, maintaining eye contact with the audience and everyone else in the room, and just overall presence. So I think that style can be either just something naturally occurring to you. Some people just, I suppose, happen to have a certain riz or a certain type of confidence. Other people perhaps want to curate something based on what they see in other people and therefore want to emulate that. Choosing a style, which we'll discuss a little bit more later, is really up to you. It's up to you, like both in terms of how you think, how you like generate arguments, and you base your style off of that, and that's easiest for you because like maybe like that's just what works for you. Or if like maybe you don't like it, that's totally fine as well. And there are ways for you to also curate your style based on what kind of debater you'd want to be and how you would idealize yourself as a debater. When discussing rhetoric, on the other hand, so this is the Google definition because like, I suppose rhetoric, to put it simply, are like the bangers. Google defines it as the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing, especially the use of figures of speech and other composition techniques, blah, blah, blah. It's not important. Usually when we think of rhetoric, it's kind of like the language you use in the round, whether it's appropriate, whether you have those like zingers that people are like, yeah, here. Um, Obviously, it's like nice to have rhetoric and style. I mean, you obviously as a baseline have these. Whether or not it's good or bad, obviously depends on how you hone it or what ends up happening. But then I want to also emphasize a few things when thinking about rhetoric and style. And this is what I would refer to as the dark arts of debate, which are things that, generally I think we should frown upon. So the first is that you should not use having good rhetoric or good style as a supplement for a good argument or good analysis. When we think of style and rhetoric, while they can be ways to win a debate, it's not because you win solely based on having like a bunch of zingers, or you win solely because you are very eloquent with the language you use, but rather you have good style because they complement your argumentation quite well. So you can't just like come into the round, throw a bunch of words around. If they don't actually come with any form of substance, that's not a good thing. And typically it's quite difficult to win rounds if you do not have that. So a good way to think of developing style and rhetoric is thinking of how can I best develop the manner by which I speak to better enhance the actual analysis and arguments I have. The second thing is that you should not be using your style in a way that's instrumentalized against other speakers or threatening other speakers. And this is where I kind of want to create a distinction between having a very competitive, aggressive, or even like sassy style that just gets mean, right? I think that these can be things that are conflated. But typically you don't want to have a threatening style because you want to intimidate the other team into losing the round or make other speakers feel bad, right? Again, you use your style, use the language in the debate to complement your arguments. and not necessarily dictate, like, try to manipulate the emotions of someone else on the opposing team or anyone within the round, because that would make the sport not fun and just like not enjoyable, and it's a bad habit to get into. And because we're learning good habits, that's something we want to avoid. The last thing is that we want to avoid using points of style and rhetoric against other speakers. So I know that style obviously comes into play when it's in the ballot, especially for other speaking formats like WSDC, where there is a specific criterion for style. But at the same time, you want to target other speakers based on the logical coherence, based on how good their actual analysis is, as opposed to whether or not they're using like good words, whether or not they're using proper like tone or appropriate pacing when they are speaking, right? Doing this is just kind of mean, again, because as we discuss, a person's style can be very personal. Your style is a reflection of your own debating style. That's kind of redundant. Your style is a reflection of who you are typically. Of like, it's just kind of an enhancement of how you speak. And while it's different typically from how you normally speak, it's very close to a lot of people. And like saying like first response, your style is cringe, or like you have perhaps some type of accent or something like that. It's just kind of mean. And we don't want to be doing that just for the integrity of the sport and just so that everyone else is like having a good time. Given these caveats, let's now delve into what contributes style. And so primarily I will be talking about style just because I feel like rhetoric is something we can talk about a little bit later, but something that is typically developed through like watching different forms of media that help you like get like, faster at thinking of like things. But we'll talk more about style right now because I think this is something that is a little bit more of a holistic and general representation of who you are, and as an aid to your analysis that matters a little bit more within the debate. So I've kind of broken it down into different elements of style. If you notice, I'm sure these aren't things that are unfamiliar to you guys. I'm sure you've heard of things like tone, intonation, etc. in like regular English classes where you learn public speaking. But the reason why I've kind of broken it up into these very simple concepts is because I think style can be hard to figure out just because you're not sure where to start. It's very confusing because so many debaters speak in so many different ways, and it can be a little bit daunting because you have to do a lot of introspection, and you're not really sure where to start. So I think that if we can break it up into different elements that contribute to how you speak, these are things that can eventually help you understand how to better tackle developing your style and help you like win rounds with style. So these are the 5 elements we'll be mainly talking about. Obviously, style isn't just constricted to these elements, and there are other things that contribute to it. But then for now, as a start, like let's just start with this, for simplicity's sake. So let's talk about the first 3. So tone, intonation, body language. So tone is just the general character attitude you have in the speech. Obviously, this can vary depending on what motion comes out, right? So typically, if it's like a serious motion, you would want to talk about it seriously because it would be like really awkward if everyone in the round is super serious talking about how like there are these different atrocities happening and like you're like out there with like this very like funny tone. So this is something important to keep into mind, what is most appropriate for the round, given whatever issues you were talking about. The second is intonation, and the reason why I think this is important is because well, I feel like speakers can have the correct tone for the round, either like let's say it's casual, serious, etc. I think that it can be a little bit difficult to listen to speakers sometimes when they are extremely monotonous, when there's no rise or fall in the pitch that they speak in, right? And at that point in time, it becomes a little bit more difficult to believe that what you are saying is convincing because you don't say what you are thinking with conviction. I think especially with respect to debate, which is a very passion-driven endeavor. You talk about a lot of marginalized individuals, you talk about a lot of issues that matter. If you don't think that it actually matters, or if people believe that to be so, it can be a little bit less compelling, even if the analysis is very good. I do think though that like at the same time, it's important to understand that like having poor style or perhaps not fully like following what I tell you in terms of like tone, intonation is not a deal breaker, right? It's not the end all be all just because you don't have these elements. But these are things that, if you want to work on them, being cognizant of them could help you in the future. The third is just body language, which is the overall presence in a round. I'm sure like you guys know what body language is. But I do think that the like way that we think of body language has changed a little bit with online debating. And we're kind of at this crossroads right now in the debating community where there are a lot of countries who are going back to being on site, who are having tournaments that are in person, and the body language is quite different there, and how you make your presence known is quite different there. And there's also still a lot of online tournaments, and how you make yourself known there is also very different because you're like a screen and I'm just a box to you, and like it's very difficult to humanize or to feel the presence of a person based on like what you see on your computer screen. Um so in general, when we think of body language, it's basically just like maintaining eye contact, having gestures, again trying to show that you're very engaged with the issues, as well as like I think that it's weird to think about like how you can guide people who are listening based on your gestures, but then sometimes it does help when you're like point A, point B, or whatever, right? When thinking of body language though, and dividing it between online and offline settings, the shift can be a little bit difficult just because maybe you're not as used to making eye contact with like the judge, or maybe you're not as used to like looking at other people who also have like their own respective body language in the round, even when they're sitting down. This is just kind of something that you get used to, the presence of another person and developing your own presence within a round. Online debating, I think that the importance of body language isn't something that should be like diminished as well. I think that like people can tell whether or not you're looking at the camera. They can tell whether or not you're looking like somewhere else or at the audience. And for judges, that does matter because it helps in showing a degree of confidence, a degree of presence, even if you were someone in a box. And I think that making yourself memorable when it comes to online debates is something that could give you an edge already in the round, because it makes it easy for the judge to give you guys the win if they remember specifically who you are, more likely to attribute certain contributions to you because you were very distinguished within the round. So these keep this in mind. And developing an overall presence is good. It can be a little bit tricky, especially when transition to offline behavior, because you're also combating with like the energy of other people. But I think that like as you get used to it and as you also gain a lot more confidence in what you are saying itself, these are things that also kind of naturally fall into place over time. Next are just word choice and precision, word choice and pace. So when I say word choice, I'm not saying that like you should use big words or words that are like or like be extremely verbose in your language, right? Like saying like more words or bigger words. I think that word choice plays a role in style because again, when we think of style as something that complements your analysis, how you choose to convey what you are thinking matters a lot. And it can be a little bit difficult to do this, especially because you have to understand how to organize an argument. But I think like for me at least, being extremely simple, or the word that I like to use is precise in how you convey your argument, is a show of like very good comprehension in the round and by extension style. And what I mean by precision is I think a lot of the time debaters, especially students that I have, can get kind of lost in their own argument because they try to integrate a lot of fluff like delta or like the meta of the round or whatever types of like big words like that, or like they make what they are saying far more complicated than it has to be because they choose to not be precise with what they are saying. They don't choose to say like what it is as it is, right? um like it can be like tempting to use big words because perhaps like you think it would make you more memorable, and while that's something that's also fair, I think that it's also important to understand whether or not it is appropriate to use those terminologies in the round, because sometimes I see especially like younger students who are still trying to get a grasp of debate terminology just kind of throw these things around to the point that they aren't actually discussing their argument nuance to the motion, but rather discussing an argument that's like it has a delta, blah 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 blah. But then every argument technically has a delta. Which is why word choice, and I suppose this is where rhetoric plays in, and being precise in how you want to convey your thoughts matters a lot. Even if it's not necessarily very complicated, I think that's already fine. The important thing is that you want the judge at the baseline to understand what you are saying, and not just understand it in the sense that like this could be any other argument, any other round, but understand how it fits to be debate winning in the round, which is why word choice and precision comes into play. The last element I want to talk about is just the idea of pace, which I think comes into two forms. So the first is that it's the speed at which you speak, right? Um, it can be tempting to speak very fast because you only have 7 minutes, especially as you get a little bit older in debate age and you start having a lot more to say. You are tempted to perhaps try to, say more by speaking faster in order to get more points across. But that can be unstrategic because you have to take into consideration whether or not the judge can write down everything you are saying, right? Judges are still people. We don't have like AI who can like, take notes for you and like discern whatever you're saying. Um Conversely, I think also being too slow has its demerits. Just because you want to keep at a pace of equilibrium where you're able to generate points to the points in a way that's like appropriate and fast um enough that the judges don't get bored or don't feel like you're beating around the bush enough. But you also don't want to be too slow to the point that like they're kind of bored and they feel like you aren't worth listening to because you were taking a little bit too long to get to the point. And that's also kind of why I think a second aspect to pace is just how fast you get the things in your argument. I'm sure you guys are familiar with like the different components of a speech, like the frame, the argument, etc., etc. I think that understanding where you want to devote the most time also plays a part in the style. And what I mean by this is some people want to devote more time to rebuttal. That's just their style of debating. Some people want to devote more time into framing. That's also their style of debating. And so understanding the pace by which you want to bring the audience in your speech is another important thing that comes into play when you think of the elements of style, right? It obviously depends on you, and at the same time, it also depends on the round, right? You might be a very frame heavy speaker, and that's just the natural inclination. And while that may work in rounds that require a lot of world building, it may also be a disadvantage in rounds that require you to be a little bit faster with world building and go straight into refutation if you have a very strong opposition team, or go straight into argumentation with integrated framing if you have a very heavy case and you need to get the case across very quickly with and tandem with the frame, if that makes sense. So thinking about this, and I bring these elements to you because I think this is just a way for you guys to kind of just think about where do I lean on the spectrum? Am I imprecise? Am I too precise? Do I speak too quickly? Do I speak too slow? And perhaps just think from there whether or not you think this works best for you or this fits for you, or whether or not there are any aspects within the elements that you want to tailor fit better to become the debater that you ideally want to be. Um yeah. So next we're going to go into discussion on what is good versus bad style. And I think that I just want to start it off by saying there is no specific style that trumps all. Many speakers obviously have very different ways of speaking, and at the core, it comes down to what you are most comfortable with, right? Like if you believe yourself just be like a funny speaker, as long as it's appropriate, why not do that if it works for you and you feel most comfortable doing that? Just because I feel like with style, and the reason why it's difficult to hone style is because it kind of becomes tailored based on the circuit you're in and based on pandering to what the judges in the circuit you are in want. Which is kind of why a lot of people just adopt the style of like who they are around, and kind of there's an echo chamber with respect to style on that front. So I think it's important to keep in mind that style is very specific to what works for you. If like, you think in a certain way, you have like a very specific rhetoric, a very specific way of like, wanting to be present in the round. Debate should be about um it's like one part talking about significant issues, but another part also being in a position that makes yourself proud of who you are and how far you've come. And I think style contributes a lot to that because it's very personal and because it depends a lot on just who you want to become as a debater. The second thing is that even if there is no good style, there is very clearly a bad style, right? Like people who are overtly rude or cringe, um, or people who are not easy to comprehend. So maybe you aren't super precise. Maybe you have a lot of crutch words, like or right, which is a very like popular crutch word that people have, because like sometimes there's a lag in your brain, or because you use too much jargon. These are obviously indicators of style that is probably not super optimal, right? And so at the baseline when it comes to developing style, you want to ensure that you at least do like traits that are probably preferred, right? such as at the baseline being clear, being easy to understand. And I think more importantly, also just being dynamic, depending on what the motion is and depending on what the round calls for you to have, right? I think that generally, like with all motions, people will have the same type of style and rhetoric, with a few tweaks depending on like what the tone of the motion is, or like perhaps maybe you might need to convey a little bit more emotions in the round based on the motion being like quite sad, or maybe like the motion is just like funny and you want to pander into that, and that's why like having that sense of dynamism within the round probably matters, and it's probably a skill that you want to train when you are actually trying to, you know, create your style. um the last thing, and I think that I've kind of been repeating this throughout the entire lecture, is that the purpose of style is simply to focus on getting your message across, right? You can't simply win on style alone, right? And while, you know, that'd be really cool, I guess, I think that it probably also wouldn't be cool, because having a lot of style but very minimal substance probably means that you're just there like yapping. And you obviously want to have very strong relevance within the round based on the message you have. And that style again is a way of enhancing your own message, but it's not a way for you to supplement like, you know, having a message to begin with. And people can very easily detect that, right? People can kind of understand whether or not you're just saying things for the sake of saying them, or because you're saying things because you actually care and you actually mean those types of things. So like bottom line of this is just don't be pressured to adopt the style of your peers or your alumni or people who are older just because you think that's the correct style to have. Style is whatever works for you and is something you should personally be proud of, and be happy with. But at the same time, always being sure that your style is still respectful, if it's within the rules of equity, matters to making sure the debate is enjoyable for everyone and not just you. Um, so now we're going to go into how do you actually develop style, which can be a little bit tricky. And so I've kind of divided into two, which is just like secondhand and firsthand learning. Very general, and you know, probably easy to grasp and comprehend. So in my experience, when learning style, I think that the first thing comes from just establishing who you want to be as a debater and what kind of debater you want to be. Whether you want to be a debater that's very sassy, whether you want to be a debater who has a lot of very rhetorically witty comments, or whether you want to be like a debater who's very scary or aggressive, right? And I think that one way to do that is just watching a lot of debate videos. I remember when I was in high school, the tip that my older alumni would tell me would be to think about debaters who you would aspire to be, debaters whose style you actually like because you like how they speak and not because you think that they're like popular, even if they're not popular, right? As long as you like how they speak and like again, it's respectful. So watching debate videos, if you're not even sure like who you think is like who the person you want to like base your style off, that's like fine. And that's why it's also good to watch a lot of debate videos. Especially because like I suppose it also helps with honing other competencies like analysis, argumentation, etc. I think the second way, and a little bit of an unconventional way, is just consuming various forms of media. And I think this is especially helpful when it comes to developing rhetoric, because again, rhetoric it boils down to the overall language. Sometimes like knowing a lot of words is helpful, and like especially when you know the meaning of those words and therefore can instrumentalize them properly within the round, that's also very good. So consuming various forms of media is good for developing that sense of rhetoric, because you are able to get from a diverse background just different ways of speaking, even like different words. I guess you could also just like open a dictionary, but that's like kind of awkward because you're just like opening a dictionary and looking for words. But I think like, you know, consuming various forms of media is good on that front. I think it's also good for you to also just develop a sense of style even. So developing a style honestly doesn't even have to be from like debaters. I think that like because style is just a vibe, sometimes people just have like vibes from like characters or like certain people who they idolize um from various forms of media. So from, let's say, like books that are like somber, maybe you want to be a somber speaker, I don't know. Those are ways you can also understand just like what kind of debater you want to be and what you think honestly like looks cool. Like I think for a lot of people, the style they choose is just what they think looks cool. And it's like no shame in doing that if that's what makes you happy. After you have already, you know, gotten your resources, understand what kind of debater you want to be, and just like, you know, maybe have some idol who you want to strive to be. Not saying you have to have one, obviously. If you want to just kind of do your own thing, like this is not a required step. But once you have all those things, then it comes into practice, right? Which you would probably do like in tandem with learning. But then firsthand obviously is also important. Um, Not just like you giving speeches, because I do think that inherently you giving speeches helps you develop like your own style. I think that how I personally was able to do this when I was like in high school is like I recorded myself giving a speech. It didn't even have to be in the round. Sometimes I just do it when I was at home and like not doing anything because like I was lame, I guess, and I didn't have anything else to do. And when you record yourself speaking, you really hear how you sound, because I think when you're in the debate, there are tendencies where you kind of like disassociate from what you are saying. You're saying the argument, your goal is to get the argument across, and it comes out without you being extremely cognizant of how you are actually saying what you are thinking, right? And that's just because it's very hard to do that. It's very hard to think on the spot, to be precise with your wording when you're also thinking on the spot how I should relay the argument, how I should respond to POIs or like rebuttals that I need to launch right now. So having the opportunity to record yourself after you speak and listen to this is honestly pretty life-changing. Like I honestly, like for me at least, I cringed a lot of times after hearing myself speak, just because I noticed that I would stutter a lot. I would use a lot of crutch words that would basically make my argument like very difficult to comprehend. And I was speaking in a way that was very obvious that I was nervous, that I didn't actually have any conviction in what I was saying. And I was kind of just in the round to say the argument and not necessarily win the debate. The purpose of style as a supplement to the argument is to help get the argument across, but it's also to provide the extra push to show that you have the rigor to win the debate. And that's why after you record yourself speaking, you can probably analyze what did I like about my speech? What did I like about how I sounded? Which is a good thing because I think introspection matters a lot with style. Sometimes like it can be difficult for other people to give you feedback on style because they don't want to hurt your feelings, or because it's very personal. But if it comes from you directly and you being able to actively shape how you want to sound like, it becomes potentially easier to also ask other people questions about what you should work on, because you're very cognizant about how you sound when you're speaking, which you typically don't get if you just like speak and then remember how you sounded when you spoke, because we're typically not the most accurate rememberers of our own speech. That's when also being proactive and asking for feedback matters. So after the round, and like especially when you are being judged, especially in tournaments are a very good opportunity to ask for feedback from a very diverse set of judges. So you have judges hailing from very different circuits, both in online and offline tournaments. Judges who obviously have different styles and preferences, and manners of speaking. And this is something very good because the feedback inherently is just like a plus. Because you obviously want to have external sources to tell you what you're doing right or what you're doing wrong. But I think it also gives you a lot of insight on what other circuits are potentially doing when you ask for tips on what kind of style you should have, um, or like what they think are the issues with your style. That's not to say that you should absolutely believe like everything that someone gives when it comes to feedback on style. Style is still very much subjective. And like I think that I've also seen a lot of students when they're trying to come up with their style feel discouraged just because someone didn't like how they were speaking. Just because someone gives negative feedback on your style, it's not the end all be all, right? But then just the act of asking feedback potentially provides a better framework for you to understand how you develop your style, how you like develop it to better tailor your style of thinking, etc. The last is just like probably developing speech exercises. Um, I do think though that speech exercises, honestly, in my experience, are easier to do when you're in a small, more intimate group, right? Just because speech exercises, like, are very intensive. So the way that like style can be changed is like many. If you use a lot of crutch words, for example, it can be very time intensive to like um like stop saying those words. It can like that makes it difficult that if you're like a full BP round in like an hour and a half training session, you might not be able to get through everyone. So my recommendation for like when you try to go through speech exercises, Like for example, we used to have speech exercises where a person would speak, and when they used a crutch word, we'd pause them and tell them to start from where we stop them and continue without the crutch word. And that would help the person like, eventually stop using that crutch word and like have a little bit better of a flow. It's hard to do though when you're like a super big group, which is why I would recommend this in a more intimate group. Sorry, if I'm being like unclear on what a crutch word is, it's like when you use right or like, or like you have this word that you turn to when you're not sure what to say next when you're trying to fill in dead air. Because I'm not sure if I clarified that before. But again, like speech exercises are helpful, obviously, in helping you like discern your style and like probably make it a little bit better from how you think it should be. I think it's also good to have like a more intimate group because you're also able to share with those people what are potentially your insecurities when it comes to your style, because it can be difficult to critique your own style. It can be sometimes very daunting to be vulnerable in that sense. That's why having a good support network for developing your style matters a lot in being able to push through with this. So now that we have gone through all of those competencies, I'm gonna now talk about winning debates with style, which I think is the last part of this lecture. Um, so so just like a few tips. The first is just understanding who you are speaking to, which is the average reasonable individual as per the briefing slides that are present in most tournaments. I do want to emphasize though that thinking of them as an average reasonable individual can sometimes be misleading. Because when you're a judge, most of the time you aren't an average reasonable individual due to a confluence of factors, right? This person could just have very specialized knowledge in what you were talking about, and therefore the biases come into play even though they are not explicitly cognizant about this. And some judges don't know how to separate what they know from what they should know because they are judges. Potentially like the judges don't even know what you're talking about, so they're not average reasonable individual because they aren't familiar. And so because you are speaking at such a high level capacity, it makes it hard for the judge to fully grasp what you are saying. And so the point of this is to kind of just don't just generalize the judge to be an average reasonable individual. I think that how a good way to think about this is to think as if you were talking to a child, someone who you can't be sure if they are familiar with the topic, but what you want to do is at least give them the baseline and equip them with the knowledge to be able to grasp the arguments, right? And if they have a very high level understanding, I think that even showing them that you have a good comprehension by providing the basics already shows them that you know what you're talking about, which could potentially offset bias they have, which happens when you don't conflate your argument with a lot of jargon. Obviously it also happens when you like know about the topic, but even when you don't, I think simplifying what you were talking about, being precise in your words, helps the judge know that this person is no nonsense. They're not trying to distract me with fluff in their argumentation. They're getting straight to the point, which makes it easier for me to listen to them, even in topics that are quite complex. And they're able to simplify very complex topics, which is an indicator of a very high level understanding of certain issues, even if maybe you aren't the most familiar with it. So I suppose this is a tip in both like comprehending and in style. Just trying to diminish complex topics at its base already shows a very good understanding of what you're talking about and could go a long way in being able to help you win rounds in the future. The second thing is just developing confidence. Obviously, like when we think of style, like generally, people who have good style are generally confident. And developing confidence seems a little bit difficult because it's like, how do I be confident, especially if you think inherently you aren't a very confident person? But I think that this boils down to just being a lot more self-assured in what you are saying. I think even in instances where you aren't sure about what you're saying, I think what I notice with some kids is that they make it very apparent to the judge that they're insecure about what they're saying. They make it quite clear that they're saying things with a question mark when the judge doesn't know that you don't know what you're saying, right? The judge doesn't always know how well equipped you are in the topic. And while I've been saying before this that style should not supplement analysis, in instances where you don't know the analysis, that's not reason for you to like roll on the ground and give up on the round, right? Um, it still matters for you to show some extent of rigor and show that you are still in it to win, which is why developing confidence matters. So it's developing confidence in the sense that you are more self-assured by virtue of maybe following the rules that Jello gave or following tips from like other people on how to better develop your argumentation. And you become more confident because you grow into being a debater more. Or even then, you can even like create a facade of confidence because this can still be helpful for winning the rounds. I just don't recommend this to be like the first option, but then if you have to, you must sometimes. But still, of course, remaining humble and still, of course, ensuring that you are using your style in a way that enhances your argument. Because, like, I suppose a good example is like if a person does something bad that they can control, like a person doesn't brush their teeth, then maybe sometimes it's justified to say you should brush your teeth. But if it's things like style that sometimes are not controllable, such as an accent, or maybe how they think, or maybe like not being as proficient with English, those are things that are like typically things you do not target and attack because they are out of the control of a person and very culturally nuanced and should not be attacked because they're protected attributes. So again, staying humble with your style. Also like continuing to reach out for feedback matters. And um is something that has to be at balance with developing confidence in the round and then after the round knowing when to come back to earth and be level-headed and gain better perspective on how you also develop your style. And even like in the round you can be very like aggressive with your style and very adamant that you think your style is the best by virtue of how you argue, but then at the same time that shouldn't like remove you from listening to how other people speak and acknowledging that the way that other people speak may be things you want to integrate, even if in that round they're your opponents. And so I think it's a good way to keep in mind that there's something to learn from everyone. And having a facade of confidence or aggression or like being very sassy should just be that. Like it should just be the in-person, in-round persona, as opposed to who you are when it comes to your actual style, when it comes to learning debate. The last thing is just focusing on using style for getting the analysis across. So again, the goal at the end of the day is how do I make everyone in debate believe that what I'm saying is worth listening to? Even in instances where you personally don't believe it's worth listening to, maybe like you don't care about the motion, maybe you like don't understand the motion, and you're not sure like why you're saying what you're saying to begin with, just as a byproduct of like not knowing that much about the round and not being extremely confident in what you were saying to begin with. um I think that when it comes to this, it's just important to like remember that style is meant to be there when analysis sometimes fails you. In the same way that style is meant to be there when analysis can only get you so far. So focus on using your style for getting the analysis across, whether or not you know what you're talking about, or like if you're like very proficient in the topic, or if you're like not super proficient in the topic. I think that developing style on ultimately like comes down to the mindset. Um, just like being very open to feedback, understanding very clearly what kind of debater you want to be, because this can be quite conflated based on like expectations from your coach, expectations from your teammate, which while you should take into account to some extent because they can be helpful, shouldn't be the determining factor for like how you speak as a debater, especially if it makes you unhappy. And so it's very personal. And like that's why the lecture honestly quite broad. I think it's also quite applicable to even other spheres. Like even if you don't want to just do British parliamentary or Asians, if you want to delve into public speaking, I think that having a good grasp on style, your style, knowing how to change your style and knowing how to tailor fit it to the audience, matters a lot and helps you get across quite efficiently and quite far in tournaments and in like everything, I guess. So that's basically the lecture. This is the Q&A portion now. If you guys have any questions, you can ask them now. um yeah, I guess either PM them to me or to Ateneo Debate Society as per the instructions that Clark said a while ago. So someone asked a question, do you think your tone affects the round and your speaks? Definitely, yeah. Um, my personal opinion is I don't think style in the sense of like whether or not you use very like high level words, or whether or not you're very verbose should matter in the round and in determining speaks. I think that majority of it should be left up to analysis. But I think that regardless, the way that people interpret style like heavily affects, especially tone. So I think that this can be in two ways. The first is that your tone can empower or disempower other people in the round. If people can sense that you're not super confident about what you're talking about, it's a debuff to you because the judge potentially finds you less compelling, but can also be a buff to your opposing teams when they feel like you're an easier target and therefore you are the low-hanging fruit in the round. That's kind of why it's like very tricky mastering style, because style, like whether you like it or not, ultimately affects a lot of the dynamics that go on that aren't as explicit. Like you can very clearly see interactions of analysis, whether or not a rebuttal takes down another thing. But it's a lot more difficult to see how someone's lack of confidence affects other teams in the round by potentially making them feel more confident or empowering them like to be a little bit more aggressive. So that's also why it's important to invest in these, because you want to be at the winning end. And you don't want to necessarily make other people feel bad, but you also want other people to acknowledge how skilled you are in the round, which is typically done through having good tone, appropriate tone, and good style. Um, okay. There's another question. So, what are your thoughts on very rhetorical interest in debate, like creative introductions? Are they just as impactful as pragmatic illustration, i.e., directly engaging the matter slash your opponents, or do they provide a much more in-depth view of the case? So, I I have a very specific opinion on like super lengthy intros, which is kind of like sometimes I'm like, why are you saying this? I feel like there are times where they like hit the mark, right? Rhetorical intros fit very well, and provide like a zinger that takes down the opposing bench. But I think sometimes creative introductions can also just get in the way of taking up time. When like I was prepping for Worlds, for example, I had very long introductions that were kind of creative. But then when I was there, a judge walked up to me. Sorry, not they didn't walk up to me. I walked up to them. I asked them for feedback. And one of their points of feedback is that typically especially in tournaments where there is a very diverse judge pool, you want the judge to pick up the pen right away and start writing. And if you're not certain whether a creative introduction, and I think this happens more so when the creative introduction is too long, because when it's too long, that it's kind of like overdrawn and the judge is just like get to the point. That's when the judge becomes more complacent and taking notes for you. They don't pick up the pen right away. And they don't become as impactful as you'd like to be because they end up taking up more time. They end up making the judge initially not super engaged, which can be difficult to gain that momentum again. Um, that's not to say like I think your intro should be lame. I think that it's just understanding the balance between a creative introduction, and an introduction that is also like, you know, appropriate for like the time limit, and like actually hits the mark, for what the round needs. Because I think for illustration, the problem I think also with creative introductions is that it can seem a little bit disjunct from the argument. If you have a very specific example for your introduction that's very creative, sometimes the judge doesn't understand how that links to the argument itself. If the argument kind of applies some different principles or some like different examples that are hard to construe as the same thing as the introduction. So like personally for me, I just think it's better to like have an like, you know, a rhetorical introduction, yeah, but not like super long, super lengthy, even if it's a sacrifice creativity, and applying more of the illustration in the argument itself. Because from the argument, you can see that this is the analysis, this is the example, and the illustration, and you understand clearly how the illustration feeds into the argument and makes the argument more compelling. Okay. Someone else has sent in a question. Admittedly, I have very, very bad posturing and gestures while face-to-face debating, and it makes it very awkward sometimes because I am used to just sitting down, waving my hands like IDK, a magician, I guess. Very fair. Are there any tips, like what should I do not to make it look as awkward as the situation is already? So I think like I get that. It's a little bit awkward having to transition back because like making your presence known on site is honestly like super hard. So I started on-site debating when I was in high school. So like I came from there, and then we had to transition online because of the pandemic. And so like you kind of get used to sitting down, being in the comfort of your own room. And I remember that when we actually transitioned back to face-to-face debating, most of our first tournament for face-to-face debating was in Spain for Worlds. And the air was so dry and it was so cold that I started choking on the air mid speech. And like for some reason, me and my partner didn't have water because it was like expensive there. Um I think that it's kind of just boils down to traffic. Shut up, David. I know you don't use Vaseline. I think it just boils down honestly to practice, right? Um I think what makes it awkward is just the uncertainty of the situation, that you're like, you're not there very often. It's not something that you're super accustomed to because you just sit down. And honestly, like forcing yourself to like stand up even when you are debating online, or forcing habits that are typically applied to face-to-face debating when you are online probably like goes a long way. So for example, when we were starting to transition back to face-to-face debating, and we were still online debating because there aren't a lot of on-site tournaments in the Philippines, but we were gonna go to like face-to-face tournaments for UADC or ABP. We would already try to get ourselves used to doing like paper notes because those are like required on site. And like typically like there's kind of like this weird connotation with and like debate surrounding whether or not online notes should be allowed. So that's why we got used to paper notes, because it also had like a different aura, I suppose. We got used to like being a little bit more like having like a few like more like gestures, I suppose, or like trying to have more presence, as well as just like having a lot more face-to-face rounds. So I think that like one aspect is practicing it online, a lot of the face-to-face competencies. The second to really help you is just like practicing more in person, like with your friends, or with your debate society. Because like no one can just tell you like stop being awkward. And typically when people tell you to stop being awkward, you kind of become more awkward because you're so much more cognizant of how awkward you are. So like just practicing it, and eventually you start to forget that you were ever uncertain or that you were ever uncomfortable in the situation to begin with, and that typically helps. Um okay. Okay. What are your tips to a debater? So very many expressive, aka me, because some people that I debated with during PSDC compared to me, to a passionate speaker with much of movements and gestures, not to mention I was also in a suit. Um, I don't know if I should take it as a compliment or something else. I mean, why not take it as a compliment, right? Like, this probably doesn't matter as much to like contributing to your speaker scores, but like I like to dress up for debate tournaments. And I know like a lot of people who also like to dress up for debate tournaments because it's kind of like um debate is like a very vulnerable activity at times, because it kind of is a testament, and a lot of people interpret it at least to be a testament to like how smart you are, like how much riz you have, or like sometimes people like ascribe it to their personality, and that's kind of why finding little joys in debate like matters. And that's why I really emphasize when developing your style to do whatever makes you happy. So like if you believe that being a more expressive debater is something that you find fulfilling, is something that you believe helps get your point across, like there's nothing to be ashamed about that. Um at the same time though, you can also be expressive. And I think there are instances where very expressive people might miss certain points of analysis or certain layers to an argument just because they are very preoccupied with providing emotion, which matters, that it might get in the way with the judge understanding what you're actually saying. So again, like it's another issue of balance, right? There's a way to be expressive, but at the same time, direct enough energy and time into the structural analysis that typically doesn't harp on heartstrings. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with like the term heartstrings, but it's like when you try to appeal to the emotion of whoever is judging. Just because like I think also sometimes judges are kind of heartless. Sometimes honestly judges themselves don't care. Which is kind of unfortunate. But I think just finding the balance. As well as like understanding balance both in the sense of like being very expressive and having the analysis, but also having like balance with like how you present yourself. So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's tips for you who's very expressive, but at the same time, with like not a lot of movements and gestures. Like again, like if you want to have movements and gestures, that's like fine. Some people like honestly kind of just stand and don't have lots of gestures. um I think that if it's something that like you think you should change, that's fine. But then if like it's just other people making you think that like, oh, because you're a politician, like that you should change it, like be like, yeah, what if I am? And just like owning up to it. And like if you find joy wearing a suit, then like why not? um do what makes you happy, because like what's anyone else gonna do about it? Okay, so I'll wait for more questions to roll in. Um, I hope I hope I am clear in answering your questions. If there are any follow-ups, don't hesitate to bring it up. Um, or like if I like misinterpret a question, or if you want to like, I don't know, add, feel free to do so also. You know, you guys can also like unmute, by the way, to ask questions. Like, I don't think, unless that's not allowed, but I'm pretty sure it should be allowed. If you want to only, of course. Okay. Okay. Um, okay. So someone asked, genuine question, but is there a way to channel your inner debate idol a lot more? Um, well, I guess like it's just like watching their videos. I don't recommend like stalking your debate idols. Um, because at the same time they're still like people. I think that it's also important to take channeling your debate idol with a grain of salt, because while there are traits in your debate idol that you want to obviously emulate, at the same time you could do like the goal is to also become a lot better than your debate idol, to surpass who they are and the achievements that they've already garnered. Um, and that's because like especially when you're really young, you guys have a lot of potential. So I think channeling your inner debate idol, and doing it a lot happens like watching their videos. Like you can ask them questions, I suppose, if you see them on site. But I also think that it's important to still be cognizant that like they're just people, and um you guys are also people. And that means that you are on the equal footing to surpass them, especially given that you can like use them as your pedal to be able to forward yourself, to be able to become much more and achieve much more than they have. So don't try to just like diminish yourself to trying to reach the achievements of your debate idol. Like, you know, you can do more. Um, oh, that's very interesting if your debate idol is your crush. Um, then you know that means that you can also crush them in debates, and then you can be their debate idol, and then everything works out. Okay, so I think that is my time up now. Thank you everyone for listening. If you guys have any follow-up questions, I'll stay in the call, or you can direct them to Clars, and then I can try to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you.
Slay. Everyone say thank you, Ali. React there or send us a chat. Slay. This is also just to see if you guys are still here. I know it's been almost 2 hours. Okay, y'all are still here. Okay, so for the last lecture of today, We're going to be learning how to prepare for debate tournaments with David Africa. Yeah. Yeah, everyone say hi, David. Slay.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yep, you're heard. Wait, I'm just setting up the screen share.
Oh, okay. I thought I was gonna screen share it.
Hey, do you want to screen share?
Yeah, that might be easier. So
Okay. Sure,
yeah,
sure.
I can do the timing. Anyway, this is not a super heavy lecture because it's just I know it's the last lecture of the night, and it's also I'm if I'm not mistaken, it's the last. Oh, sorry, that's my homework. It's the last lecture of the set of we have like 4 sessions, right? And this is the last one. So this is not gonna be super heavy. I imagine most of you are quite tired already. So this is mostly just some tips on how to prepare for debate tournaments and in general how to approach debating over the course of your career. And I'll have some examples that are like debate useful, so it's not all fluff, but it'll be mostly fluff. You could just ask questions whenever in the chat. That's my recommendation, so that you can just sort of ask it and I can answer it as we go. All right, I'll just get started. People can I'll probably intermittently ask for like a react or like a message in the chat, like could you all type one in the chat like this, just to make sure you're all alive. And my math teacher makes me do this a bunch, so because it really is linear algebra out there. Well, all right, fair enough. Some of you can follow and obey orders and others can't, so that's just how it is. Okay. So we're gonna go over 4 things: mindset and motivation in debate, some practical things to do before a tournament, um, making the most out of each round and preparing yourself for that, and then processing loss and understanding winning. So let's first start with mindset and motivation. So the first thing to remark is that you should really care about mindset. Mindset is, I would say, the most reliable thing to develop over the course of your career. You can run hot streaks in tournaments and you can do really well, and in other tournaments you'll do really awful. And the only thing consistent between those 2 things will be mindset. Your debating can fall out of vogue, like your style can just be out of meta, or you could be totally uninformed one day. Form in the sense that of your performance in tournaments from the day to day is temporary, but class or the overall trajectory of your career is permanent. And so mindset is really the most consistent way to affect that, because it will be how you carry yourself even in light of changing circumstances. Uh, the other reason for why you should care about mindset is that the only reason you could be attending this seminar is because you have a goal you want to achieve. Like, I presume that most people attending a workshop like this are like kind of debate hardos in some sense. Like you're not debating just for fun. You're in debate because you have a goal, and by attending this, you admit that your mindset is insufficient to some degree. Like you have at some point failed, and this is likely a function of perhaps your current skill level, which is in turn a function of an insufficient mindset. So by construction, your mindset is insufficient. Um, so that means that you need to work on it to some degree. And finally, of course, is that you have limited time. So from the previous lectures you've done, there are many things to work on. There is Matterloading, there's your style, there's arguing politics, there's arguing econ, there's arguing IR, especially at higher levels of debate where skill sets become less generalizable and you have to start specializing more and more to make incremental gains. You have very limited time. So this creates an optimization problem where having the correct mindset in order to make choices about developing yourself becomes more and more important. In other words, as you get better, the more wasting time becomes an impediment to your growth in debate. So that's why we should care about mindset. One, to give you more energy and more effort to devote to debating, but also to have the right approach to know how to make decisions in the first place. So if you can think of debate as a set of skills that you can each learn one by one, then your mindset or your motivation is the most important skill to learn first, because it helps you pick between other skills to start developing. So having said that, what mindset should you have? So there are 3 points. The first is you should be prepared to fail honestly. I don't know if any of you read Blue Lock. Could you give me a soccer ball emoji in the chat if you have read Blue Lock? And a soccer ball emoji in the chat if you haven't read Blue Lock. So just put a soccer ball emoji in the chat. Um, you can do this by pressing the add emoji button, and then there should be a soccer ball there, and then that should work out in life. Or you can also copy paste from someone else's. That also works fine. So I don't know if any of you have ever read Blue Lock, but there's a scene there where someone loses, and then the weirdo guy in charge of the camp is like, um, there's no point in making excuses like, oh, we'll get them next time or something. Because sorry, not the camp director, like one of the players. And it's like that is probably true. You probably have next time. But that is not failing honestly. Like you have to at some point admit that yes, there were circumstances that affected your performance in the tournament. Oh, my partner was like this. Oh, the judges were bad. But like if you look at any of your debate idols, I used to have a debate idol who I used to idolize when I was in high school, Glenn Tuazon and Leloy Claudio. I don't know if their names are still remembered in the circuit. But I'd lose. I'd complain to my coach, and my coach would say, I complained about bad judges to my coach, and then my coach would say, "Do you think he would have ever? Do you think Glenn and Leloy would have lost to these people? No, right? Even if for a bad judge, you have to win by a mile in order to win by an inch. Just win by a mile. Like the only at some point, um, there will be enough impediments to make the effort you need to exert Herculean to win a round. But whether or not you exert Herculean effort is up to you. So you must be prepared to fail honestly. At some point, you have to take on personal responsibility. And the readiness and willingness to admit personal responsibility for a failure is the first step in honestly admitting that you can grow in a direction. Um, this might sound like fluff, right? But it's like if you're not taking comments because you think the judge is crap, like you're just not going to learn about what made you lose, right? Like that's just practically not helpful. And in terms of principle, it's just not the right way of going about things. So you should be prepared to fail honestly. The second tip I have is to learn to run hot and to research them. So I'll tell a brief story about this team who I really respect in Belgrade 2022 Worlds, which is Dion and Sean, which is a team from NUS, Singapore University. And that team did not do super well in the preliminary rounds. I think they broke pretty high, but I don't think anybody really considered them as favorites. But then they really like ran hot, and then they started winning rounds from the octafinals and the quarterfinals. And there's a moment in the speech in the semifinals where you can see them start to believe. Sean is a guy I respect quite a lot. We drink a lot together. In Vietnam, we were hanging out quite a lot for Worlds, and we were both complaining, and we judged the final together. And Sean is a person I really admire for his brilliance, but for his temerity most of all, because in that semifinals, there's a point where he starts his speech, and it's a really hard round in the semifinals. All four teams in that round are great, and then there's a moment where Sean says at whip, he says, "Fuck it, I'm going for the first." You must have to learn to run hot, and in that sense, that you must understand that no matter who you were before, you can still give a speech that can win any round. If you're high schoolers right now, you can beat college students. If you're a college student, when you eventually become one, hopefully, you can beat college students from other countries. And if you're a college student and you're in the biggest debate tournament in the world, you can win that tournament. Because debating, while sometimes not entirely fair, is one of the few sports where you can you're supposed to judge something on the basis of the speech itself. Like you're supposed to judge it on the basis of like what you give, which means your past performance doesn't mean anything. It shouldn't mean anything. Like if you did well or poorly in a round before, that really doesn't mean anything. So you have to learn how to run hot, and then understand that when it comes to step up to the podium and give your speech, if you are feeling yourself, you can give a speech that can change the world. You just have to be ready to do it. Somebody messaged me, and if you're a master student, well, then if you're a master student, you should retire. In any case, so you have to learn how to run hot. In the opposite sense, you also have to learn how to reset your mental. Every person has something different for themselves, but bar none, all people can get tilted. Most people can have like a streak of rounds that can really crush them and make them feel very, very, very bad. Like they can do really poorly, like this Marvi who apparently lost 3 rounds straight. So don't do that. But eventually you'll eventually lose a round that you thought you won, or you lose a streak of rounds, and after each round you're like, oh, the next one I'll win, and then you lose that round too. You have to learn how to reset your mental, because the collapse of your mindset will dictate a lot about your next speech. It will mean that you don't have the bravery to make an argument that would win the round, but because you were not brave enough to say it in that way, or you didn't think you had it in you, you don't say the argument and you lose the round. Even if you just look like you're losing, or like you you look defeated, a judge is less likely to give you the win, because judges are also buoyed by selfish incentives, where if they will not give a lot, they will, if a team is giving them an excuse to make them lose, then they will make them lose, because they're also worried about feedback. And if a team feels like they will lose, then the judge will probably think, oh, this team won't give me negative feedback if I give them the fourth. Right? So you have to learn how to reset your mental, because that will tangibly affect the quality of speeches you give in the tournament, and moreover will make the tournament less fun for you. So what I like to do when my mental gets like really tilted is I just like um I consume like some sort of hedonistic thing. For me, it's mostly showers and food, and exercising. So during One Worlds, where I was doing really poorly, and I was living up to what I thought I should be doing, I after every round I would shower. And at some point, the mental just reset, and I forgot about the last day where I did really poorly, and we did quite well in the last day. More recently, in Luzon Intervarsity, I was quite annoyed because we got the fourth in the round, in the last round, where I thought we got first or at least second. And I did not find the OA too impressive. I actually thought the OA was quite bad. So, but I was like, I was just looking at the judge. I wasn't like glaring at them. I was just looking at them. I was thinking, I cannot wait to get a sandwich. Um, so I was just trying to reset my mental so that for the next day, it's basically a new tournament. So you have to learn what pushes your buttons and what helps you. For some people, resetting their mental means, oh, they need a clean slate and they need to refresh, become basically a new person, like getting um like like getting a refresh. But also in the same sense, you have to get ready to understand that sometimes that won't work for you either. Like for some people, the best way to reset their mental is just to make themselves less happy, which I think is kind of unhealthy. But I kind of get it, right? Like you sort of need to have that dog in you, where if you're pretty unhappy about your life, you actually get better at debating by being more unhappy. There was a point in debating where I was like that in like 2020, um, also LIV, where I was like, dang, we're not gonna win this tournament. So I kept watching montages of G2 in League of Legends where they're like, watch me. And nobody believed in them, but they still did pretty well. So I was like, So you have to learn what lets you run hot and what lets you reset your mental. Like what makes you feel brave in debate and what makes you feel afraid. And you should try and make sure that you're enjoying debate, etc., in order to make the most out of it. So in other words, what mindset should you have? Well, it will depend from person to person for what your triggers are in terms of doing well and doing poorly. But you should learn how to reset it. You should learn how to egg it on when you know that it will be good for you. The final tip or piece of advice for mindset is that you have to understand that you have to be willing to live up to the bill that your dreams charge. Like if your dream is to do this or to do that, you have to understand that you cannot feel entitled to it, at least until you have put in the work that makes you entitled to it. Even then, it's still a bit bad to be entitled to it, but I think the sense of deservingness that a lot of people have is actually not super worth the work that they put in. Like I think that some people would be like, well, I'd like to break a new ADC, which is like fine, right? Breaking a new ADC is a pretty big achievement. But if you're not doing like prep tournaments, you're not reading every day, you should expect the sort of results that come out, which is that it'll be pretty unlikely that you break unless you're already pretty talented as a speaker. So you have to understand that if you're going to strive for big dreams, and that's fine, dreaming is free, dreaming is very good and can help you really enjoy debate. You also have to understand that you will never achieve it unless you're really lucky or you put in the work. Ideally, you want to do a little bit of both. You also have to understand that sometimes the biggest cost in dreaming is that you do everything right and you still don't win, or you still don't get the dream you want. Like you do everything you want and you still don't get into the world scene, which I was pretty sad about when I was in high school. I thought, oh, I worked so hard. But I had to understand that um, you can dream as big as you want and work as hard as you want, but you're not entitled to an outcome. You are entitled to the fruit of your labor, which is never the outcome that you want. Because in debate tournaments, right, it's like there will be 2 people or 3 people if it's Asians, approximately 2 people that win and come out with a trophy. And maybe if your goal is a top 10 speaker, there will be 10 people. That is an exceedingly small amount out of the many people attending the tournament. So you have to understand that you are not entitled to a specific result. And so you have to learn to enjoy the work itself. You have to learn the sensation that you're actually learning, or you have to enjoy the feeling of giving a better and better speech every day, even if it will not necessarily make you win a round, because you will not always get the result that you want. So you have to understand that you must be willing to live up to that bill, or to the cost it charges you. The chief cost among those being that you can never 100% guarantee a result. Okay. Now that we've talked a little bit about mindset, Ali has mentioned some of these before, but just in terms of mindset, in terms of actually debating, like, don't hear loudly or make faces during rounds and after. That's exceedingly cringe. Like, honestly, if you're upset that you lost, you can just look at them, and you don't have to make a face. Like, I think you like, you're free to complain if you want in whatever group chat that you have, but I think it's like that's kind of unnecessary. Just like, I mean, I'm not like I have complained before about judges, right? I do that a bunch. But it's like, it's kind of weird to do it in the middle of the round and be disruptive. So just like, be normal. Don't harass your judges after. Don't fall asleep during a round if you're a judge, or even if you're a debater. Give people an okay amount of time to raise POIs. It's also exceedingly cringe to wave them down right away or to shout over them. In the same way, it's also exceedingly cringe to give POIs for very long and then shout at the speaker. And also, don't insult people. Like, that doesn't help. Like, you will be cringe, and then uh, it will make it so bad if you do insult someone and then they fire back and their response is funnier than your insult, and at that point you will crumble as a person. So just don't do that. Just be a nice person. Okay. So that's what I have for mindset and motivation. I'll now take a brief minute to check if anybody has any questions for this part. If not, you can put number 0 into chat. Okay. Seems like people have no questions, or they have questions but they're not typing 0 in the chat. Um, please do one of those things. Okay, I'm just gonna move on. I'm presuming most people are asleep at this point or something, but I suppose now this for the benefit of the recording. Okay, continuing. So now I want to talk about practical things to do for the tournament, like before the tournament happens, or in other words, like how to actually prepare now that a tournament has arrived. Before a tournament has arrived, but now that it's on your calendar. So the first tip I have is to think about how seriously you want to take this tournament. Like, this lecture is for quote unquote big tournaments. I don't need big as in like, oh, it has to be a major, but just like a tournament you really want to do well in. Because like, if I'm being honest, right? If you're watching a lecture or a seminar on how to do well at the tournament, you probably care about this tournament. So this advice is not for people that don't really care, because like, just do whatever you're gonna do anyway. This tournament is more. This advice is more for people who are like, I really want to do it this tournament. I don't have a solid plan for how to do that, and I would like to figure out what steps I should take to make sure that I have a good time at this tournament. Okay, I just got a question. I'll answer that after this slide. So, in terms of other tips, first you want to minimize worries. Like, you want to make sure you have transpo, you have accommodations, you have reg settled. Like, this is just helpful. Like, it is just straightforwardly helpful, because if you don't have these things, you will be very annoyed and stressed during the tournament. Like, I know that's you're all high schoolers, so it's like, usually you should have a moderator handling these things for you, but like, sometimes you will be in charge of it, and other times there will be unexpected mistakes. So you want to make sure that if you're going abroad for a tournament, you want to have your visa settled like a few months before already. You want to make sure that you know what's in, like you have prepared stuff for the hotel room you're going to, or if someone's house, if you're crashing there, and like you want to bring towels, you want to bring spare clothes, etc. Like you need to be able to go there, and you need to have reg settled. Like if you're stressed about money in the tournament, or you're stressed about paying for stuff there, like you'll have a harder time debating. Like for my last PSTC, I was extremely stressed because I was looking at Ateneo admissions results, and I was refreshing my phone during the round, and not only did it mess with my debating, but also when I got in, I think it was Eton that was speaking or something, and then I was like, "Oh my gosh, I got in!" in the middle of his speech, and then Ethan was so surprised. He was like, "Oh," while he was giving the speech. So I think just like make sure like you're minimizing your worries about other things during the tournament itself. You should also Matterload about recent events. So Jello already gave a lecture about Matterloading. So you want to know about like ongoing conflicts, the news cycle. My advice on this is you should be able to pull like a proper noun for like each major country or event. Like you should know what the name of the CEO of Tesla is or something, right? Like you should be able to know basic facts so that you're able to cite things with confidence. It's less really about being able to cite specific events, historical events, but more about being able to confidently claim facts about like general facts. Like it, in fact, a fact that you could infer by yourself, but you want to be able to confidently say it so that the judge will be guaranteed to believe you. Like we probably have some guess about the type of country that Iran is, but it really helps to know that they're an Islamic fundamentalist country that has strong control over media and the freedom of speech. So it's really hard for people to rebel there. Let's say if you're doing a debate about Iran. So it's good to know about these things, but it's even better to be able to cite things with confidence. Like, oh yeah, Ayatollah Khomeini is like extremely authoritarian, etc., etc. So you want to matter load about recent events, and you want to have a general impression of the type of people, the type of characters in these events. Okay, now I will look at the chat, and someone sent me a question. The question is, what do you recommend when you are focused on the mental itself during the tournament? Like you can't think of anything other than the fourth that you got, etc. You should like do some jumping jacks or something. Like I don't know. Everybody has their own mental fixes. Like yeah, for me it's just like, gosh, I want to get a sandwich, or like I will go watch a bad movie in between rounds or before I go to sleep for the day. During Worlds, I was like scrolling through TikTok to YouTube Shorts, like on my bed for hours, because it's like get my brain off this. And that can help. Like in general, what will work will be different for people. Like I know some people like they read a book, other people would just sleep, and that's fine. You should just sort of know, like you should do some sort of like personal therapy for yourself and be like, well, what do I enjoy doing? What takes my mind off of things? Like honestly, if you don't know, just try out a bunch of stuff. Like it might help to do jumping jacks, which is what I've done before. If you can't think of anything, then just like ask your partner, talk to your partner about the round. Um, but it's not good to always be thinking about the fourth or previous results in the rounds. So what I personally do, yeah, as like I said, is I take a shower if I can, or I eat some kind of food or drink some kind of like beverage, like an iced tea or something. And I just like focus on like the physical sensation of like being alive as opposed to this hypothetical sport you've created, which is debate. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. Um, uh, other practical things to do for a tournament to prepare. The first is you want to get in some spars if you can beforehand. Um, and what I mean by spars is you want like serious competitive spars. In between tournament seasons, it's fine to have like fairly easygoing practice rounds where you just like explore, give different speeches that you think are fun, not really take it too seriously, which is fine, right? Like you can't be drilling all the time. But in the lead up to the tournament, you want to get at least a few good, high quality spars where you treat it as competitively as you do a tournament. That is important. The thing that distinguishes a spar from, say, a practice round is that you are debating, like, you are trying to emulate the conditions in which you debate in a tournament. You are trying to make those conditions consistently your best debating conditions, which means you have to do some practice in a tournament, in a format that is serious and that emulates the tournament structure. It doesn't have to mean that you have to reconstruct the whole tournament, but just you want to get the impression or the frisson in the air that you are debating for real. What sometimes people do is they get speakers from other institutions, so they're not always debating against their friends, or they will get speakers They will like maybe say, okay, everybody, we have to come today, and so they make sure that people come, or maybe they put up some incentive like quota points or something, in order to make those spars high quality. Um, so you would like maybe to have a judge there if you can. In general, though, you will at least at minimum want to practice in the format and modality of the tournament you're going to. If the tournament is online, you will practice with your online setup. If the tournament is BP, you practice in BP. If it's AP, you practice in AP, etc., etc. So you want to make sure that you are comfortable with the tournament conditions as close as you can. Like you probably can't control for how cold the air is, like what Ali brought up, where she chokes on her saliva. But at least you want to mimic the actual debating itself, and so you want to expect, okay, what would I do if people are really trying to win and they're aggressively POIing me? How would I wave them down in this format? How am I going to read my notes in this format? That's another big thing. Being able to read your notes properly is quite important. A lot of people in the lead up to Worlds did not anticipate that they would not be allowed to use their laptop. So in Worlds, they were extremely stressed because they weren't used to returning the paper notes. But at this point, Toby and I had already done a few prep tournaments where we had written out our notes on paper. We were debating together in person in front of a screen, since there were no online on-site tournaments at the time, and we were standing up. We were not sitting down when we were speaking, which means that we weren't out of breath when we actually were giving speeches while standing up in person. Um, that's the first thing. The second trick is to take it easy. So you don't want to put too much pressure on yourself. I know that it's sort of contradictory, right? In the first one, I'm saying you should treat some spars pretty seriously, but I think you also don't want to make every waking moment consumed by debate. So you will want to still plan out your activities and live your life like you're a normal person. So watch movies with friends and do your homework. The reason for why it's important to take it easy is because the more you build up this tournament in your head that you really need to do well, the less good you will actually do, because you can only fail your expectations after they get to a certain point. Like there's a point where you think about the tournament so much and you envision it going like this, like this, like this, like this. You can only really fail them. Like at some point, for a few tournaments, I was expecting I would win. I get overall best speaker, etc., etc., etc. And like I would win, but then I get like third best speaker or something, and I would just put too much pressure on myself because I'd spent the entire week thinking about it. So like, don't don't think about it too much, because if you do, you will set unreachable expectations for yourself that you will find impossible to meet. So don't put too much pressure on yourself. In practical terms, what does this mean? Basically, force yourself to live life like normal. Don't put too much, at least in the week beforehand. It especially after a season of sparring and intense training, like let's say in the lead up to PSDC, right, where we would have like even in the summer, and before the first semester, because it's in the end of the first semester for when I was in Ateneo High, we would have the entire summer be training, and then we would do consistently drills and training throughout the first semester, and then for a week before that, I would just chill. And I would just sort of leisurely read and Matterload and read up on the news, but not put too much pressure on myself, because at this point I was ready to burst. So you don't want to burn out in the middle of the tournament already. That's number two. Number three is you want to spend some time with your partner. I don't mean like date your partner or anything, but I mean more you want to think about um you want to think about your chemistry with your partner, and you in general want to make the partnership as easygoing or as uh I guess as frictionless as possible, which means you want to at least know this person is a reasonable human being, and you want to set expectations for them. So you want to know that if they train, you expect them to train at least this much, and you will train at least this much, and you can split the division of labor like this. Um, like you don't want to find unpleasant things about your partner in the middle of the tournament, like that they're kind of cringe, or that they yell at people, or that they're like whatever, right? Like you want to have to get a feel for the type of person that the person you're debating with is, and you want to adjust to that if you can and if it's reasonable. So like have a sense for what prep time is like, for example, if they like to lead prep or if they like to follow prep, or how they think about motions and whether or not you should adjust, or even just what their speaker position will be. Like you want to have an understanding of the person you'll be debating with, because for the tournament, especially if it's a big tournament, you will spend most of your waking hours in their vicinity. Like especially if it's a physical tournament and you might room with them, right? Like you're spending basically what a whole weekend just sort of bonded to this person by the hip. Um, and so you will want this person to at least like you want to know this person's not evil, and you want to be chill with them basically. So spend some time with them, get to know them better. That's important, especially if a lot there might be interpersonal issues that arise, or like You don't know how prep will go, which can obviously be a very practical problem. Okay. Before I get to this next section, so I'd like first to ask if anybody has any questions again. I guess for this one, could I get people to put the number 2 in the chat, please? Everybody, the number 2. Okay. And also, if people have any questions for this section, now's a good time to ask them. I'll give another minute for it. Okay. No questions, so I will move on to the next slide. So now, in the tournament itself, so why am I putting a slide about how to get the most out of each round in a presentation about how to prepare for a tournament? Well, this is just another part of mindset. So obviously you're doing the tournament for a reason, like you want to do well at the tournament. But you have to understand that the rounds in the tournament are also preparations for rounds later in the tournament. That is, by the end of let's say in PSDC, like round 7, you should be a very different debater from the person you were in round 1. This is because we come into tournaments still not yet fully ready and still not yet fully finished, and rather each round should cumulatively add to the skill and quality that you have as a debater. This is something that you will inevitably encounter if you debate for long enough as well. But sometimes you will really just have like a I don't know if anyone watches Jujutsu Kaisen. Like you'll have like a black flash moment in the middle of a round, and you will carry that growth with you for like the rest of your debate career, or at least for the rest of the tournament. You want to get the most out of each round because a crucial part about winning tournaments is that they adjust to the conditions in the tournament that become emergent or become clear as time goes on. They get used to the type of debating there, and they excel. In other words, the best debaters don't just learn before the tournament, but they learn especially within the tournament, and with each round they grow successively to become better debaters. So first, how should you do this? So the first thing is you should always ask for feedback. Like even if you're pissed, even if you're annoyed at the judge, ask for feedback. You don't have to ask questions about the feedback if you really don't think it's that useful, but you should at least have an understanding for why the judge gave you the loss. The reason for this is that one, they might judge you again in the future, and so it's good to have a good idea of what the judge thinks. And two is that even a judge you think is really dumb will have a reason in their head. Like this reason they might not articulate very well, but they gave you the loss for a reason. Like they have a reason in their head. If they didn't roll the dice, they will have a reason, which means even if you don't have to take that reason to heart, you should at least understand why you lost so that you can improve on it better. There's always a lesson to be learned, even from the worst judges, and especially from the best judges. But sometimes some of the most striking lessons you will learn are from like from people that you arrogantly think are worse than you. Because I know a lot of the time it's like, oh, I feel like I'm a great debater. I shouldn't ask like advice from this novice. When in fact, uh, one of the very good features of a good debate society culture is that anybody can give comments to anybody. It's sort of like if you're a chef, right? Like you can make food. You don't have to be a chef or a professional cook to criticize the food. You can just say, wow, this tastes awful, right? Like people can observe a speech and have opinions about it, and can make observations about it, because the skill set required to observe a speech is very different from the skill set required to craft a speech. In other words, there's always something to learn because most human beings are innately equipped with a sense for how good a speech is. And that advice will usually be useful to you, which means you should always ask for feedback because it is just practically useful. Like there will be arguments to do this for like, oh, you want to look good in like a perceptual sense, like you want people to think that you're kind to novices or whatever. Like maybe, like if you want to play the politics game, maybe you can think about that. But like the most important thing is that you really do learn from everybody. And so you should always ask for feedback. Like it is one of the most important features of humility that you be willing to learn from any source, no matter how humble, no matter how large in stature. That's the first piece of advice. Second piece of advice, you want to shamelessly steal arguments and turns of phrase, and you want to understand them well. The second part is the hard part. a lot of people will steal arguments and turns of phrase. Some of the best arguments I've ever run were really just arguments from other people. For example, the argument in AVP 2022 finals was really just an argument that we had seen a friend of ours, Toby and I, a friend of ours, Abhinav and Arth, that they had run in a tournament before. And we were like, let's also do this because it also applies in this debate. But because we understood why they did that argument and in what context they did it, we could apply it here. So you should shamelessly steal arguments and turns of phrase because you don't have infinite time to think of every argument in the world. And there's just so much talent out there. There's just so many brilliant speeches out there. And so it's really like, it really doesn't matter if it's an original thought or not, because no thought is original. All thoughts are done through some mimesis, whether conscious or subconscious. So you should shamelessly steal arguments because that's really the point of tournaments, right? Like the point of tournaments is to meet new people, but more importantly, meet new styles of debating, right? And those new styles of debating will have something interesting, something to learn from. One thing I have an example for this later, but it's like just the types of things you can learn can really make you grow and change as a debater. Just because you add more and more to your skill set, you become familiar with this type of argument, and you thought you knew it before until you learn about a different way to make that argument that can be really interesting. For example, there is this sort of cringe tradition sometimes, and like in that was pretty prevalent, maybe like 2020, 2021 in online debating, where it's like in European tournaments, it would be like, well, you have to explain why left-wing people are good. Like, what if left-wing policies are bad? And so arguing for a left-wing government is not good necessarily, right? And it's like fair. It's kind of a pithy observation. It's not really that interesting nowadays. But we were like, that could be useful. So we were like, is there another way we can use this type of argument? And well, we actually used it because in a different debate, the debate was about social movements being associated with religion. And one side had argued that it would be very good if social movements got stronger. So our approach was to like, okay, what can we take from what we did before? Well, we saw that they said, what if a good thing that you thought was good was actually bad? So in fact, the reason for why they use this type of argument is because before in the past, flipping something that you thought to be good to actually be bad changes the entire argument. It basically reverses the value of the argument and makes it yours by saying, we agree everything that you say and the outcome that you say happens, but we actually think the outcome is bad, not good, right? And in this sense, you could say, if it's about social movements being more likely to succeed, what you could say is maybe social movements aren't good. Maybe social movements could be bad. For example, some social movements are for reproductive healthcare, others are against reproductive healthcare. Like you have pro-abortion people, but you also have people outside the abortion clinics that are yelling at women and telling them to die and they're going to hell, right? Like, so you should understand these arguments well because you can use them and apply them in different contexts. That's what makes the great debaters great, which is that they know the motivation behind something so that they can use it in a constellation of different ways. And there's always sources to improve from. Even just turns of phrase, like referring to Ali's lecture, right, about style and substance, right? You can just try and emulate your favorite debaters by just using the words they use, and you don't have to say it in the same way they did. You could say it in a different way, or you could change a few things about it, and over time that becomes incorporated into your vocabulary. From a debater, I used to end my speeches like, "We are proud to propose." Now for a while I said, "We affirm" or "We negate," because that was how they said it, and I was like, that's pretty cool. And it just made me happy to say it, even if it didn't really add anything to the speech. It was just a different way of ending my speech, right? But those turns of phrase can like really spruce up your speech and make you just be more proud of it or make you enjoy it. But it can also be a more elegant way to explain an argument that was previously quite complicated. An example of this I was taught by my coach is the capital cushion argument, which is in really just a neat turn of phrase for an argument we already know how to make. An argument this is an argument against monopolies, the argument being that monopolies might fail, right? So if a monopoly fails, the corporation running the monopoly fails, the people and the government lose access to a vital service. Let's say it's oil, right? I think the example given before was Petrobras in Brazil. If that oil company collapsed, right, then you would lose all the oil. But if you instead had competition, where you had a vibrant economy of competing businesses, then even if one of those businesses failed, you would have still a sea of other businesses to take their place. So in other words, you had what was called a capital cushion, where assuming failure, markets became resilient to failure. To me, this turn of phrase was very startling because it was a very evocative way of capturing what we knew in that argument to be true, but could now easily be visualized by the judge. Another example, there is there was an argument about affirmative action for the ugly. And one of my coaches had told me before that one way to argue about aesthetics is to talk about the pervasive tyranny of beauty, how beauty standards are inculcated from a very, very young age. And so while it might seem a kind of sort of like a meme debate or a funny debate to say, oh, the affirmative action for the ugly, like, oh yeah, the prime minister should get extra money because they're just so ugly, right? Like, there's actually quite a neat turn of phrase that you can use to express what is actually quite a well-known but hard to articulate discrimination. There is a pervasive tyranny of beauty where subconsciously people will not be in friend groups because they're uglier. People will not get hired for jobs and have less economic opportunities because they're uglier. So you could say this turn of phrase helps you understand. A turn of phrase is not just a turn of phrase. It is a way of viewing the world or viewing an argument that could previously not have been obvious or available to you. Third, like I said before, you really want to internalize that you can beat anyone. Like, this just makes you more brave and more willing to give speeches. I cannot distill this for you. Like, this is just something like debating is about experience. So you just have to do debating, and you will eventually come across a moment where you do better than you thought, and you think to yourself, "Wow, I can beat anyone." Like, this is like sort of a reality of things that you just have to debate enough to eventually have that moment where you believe in yourself 100% and fully. For me, this moment was like in a high school tournament in second year where I was a semifinals against the person that recruited me into debate, and we beat them. And we didn't think we had done anything super special. But it's that moment where I sort of became sentient as a debater, and I realized I don't have to live in the shadow of another person's debating. I can be my own debater, and I can win even if I think that person is good, because I can believe that I'm better. So you have to internalize that you can really beat anyone and have that moment where you're like, wow, for a moment I can see the horizon. The top of the mountain looks so reachable, not because the mountain has gotten any shorter or any more shrunk, but that you realize how far you can climb. Okay, finally, again, like I said before, you want to be open to new styles and approaches. I don't just mean in terms of stealing their arguments and turns of phrase, but think about other design choices that they've made. For example, the Canadians, what they used to do, I don't know if they still do it now, is they would have the rebuttal at the end of the speech. This might be a deliberate choice because you want to first release your arguments, which is what the judge will evaluate your speech on, even at the cost of sacrificing the immediacy of rebuttal of the last things that the previous speaker said. So each style will have its own benefits and have its own usefulnesses. Like some speakers' way of speaking will be more direct than others. Sometimes this is good. Sometimes this doesn't allow the judge to appreciate the gravity of the argument. So you want to think actively as well about the design choices you're making in your speech, whether or not you're ordering your arguments in a certain way, whether or not you're making rebuttal choices in a certain way. All of these things affect the holistic sum that is your speech. And so you want to be open to trying out new things, like trying out new ways of organizing your speech, say new ways of saying, okay, instead of saying I want the conclusion to be at the very end of my argument, I want the conclusion to be said at the beginning of my argument so that they know what to say. Even if this comes at the cost of sometimes the judge is confused at the end of the argument. Oh, what was the point of it all? Okay. Let's give an example of what I meant about getting the most out of each round. So an example of a debate I did before. If any of you watched the World lecture I gave like a month or two ago. So I gave an example about something called a civil disobedience motion, where the motion was like, this House believes that progressive judges should not punish or heavily mitigate sentences for civil disobedience. This was in light of Black Lives Matter protests, where a lot of protesters were getting arrested, and what we felt to be in a somewhat unfair way. In opening government, we gave a lot of arguments about how we want progressive judges to advance their progressive agenda. This will help the movement because if you're not arrested, you can go out and rally on the street, etc. And this was an American tournament. At the time, we had really only done European tournaments and Asian local Filipino tournaments. So we were very unused to the American circuit. Even though we gave what we thought were very good and well fleshed out arguments, we still lost to our closing government. And the reason for this was because our closing government ran, well, I thought in the end is now a much stronger argument, even if it's a lot more basic, which is that if you punish or arrest and put in prison a civil disobedient, they will not be able to put food on the table. So their kid might starve, or their kid might have to pull out of school. They might lose their job. This is an outcome that is much worse than, let's say, the prospective outcome of marginally losing a vote because some people aren't able to rally. The most direct effect that a progressive judge can have on the lives of people on the ground is to make sure that they're able to feed their kids and they're able to put food on the table and keep the lights on, right? So progressive judges, what we had not understand about the debate was that we thought the spare debate was one way. Oh, it's from the lens of progressive judges and what their goals are and the progressive movement as a whole and how civil disobedience could really be useful for society. But what we didn't understand was like the American debaters in that circuit had a penchant for running direct, concrete, very visible impacts. And we were like, wow, this is really good. Like this is quite a stellar argument to make. Even if it's very basic, because to us it was extremely new. So we incorporated this new style, and we were much more ready to say, okay, we have these obvious impacts, and we'll run them first. We'll say people don't starve, people are happier, and so on and so forth. And that was really helpful because it helped us run a more complete case where we had obvious impacts that were for the short term, were very clear and concrete, and we had very long-term impacts that appealed to what we felt was the spirit of the motion. In other words, we learned from that round, and that really helped us tangibly grow as debaters. And in the end, we eventually ended up winning the tournament because we were able to apply what we learned. But in addition to this, we were also able to incorporate that into the type of speeches we were making. Like we didn't just say, okay, we'll take this argument and we'll steal it again, but rather we took the lesson that that argument was implying, which was that our style and understanding of arguments was not enough. It's not enough to just fight for the spirit of the debate, but it's important to also hedge and try different types of approaches in one speech in order to maximize the expected value of that speech in the round. Okay, before I get into the last part, which is processing loss and victory, do people have any questions? If not, could you please put a 3 in the chat? Thank you very much. No more emojis for everybody. Please put a 3 in the chat, like so. Like so. Unless you have a question. Someone asked, how do you prep for math Olympiads? You practice problem-solving questions instead of just wrote normal problems. Like you want to practice problems where you don't know how to solve it rather than problems where you do know how to solve it. Like it's easy to solve like a computational problem of like, oh, you have to do this and apply this theory. But it's harder to do it when it's a problem you just straight up don't know how to solve. So practicing that and applying different heuristics is pretty useful. A comp in what? Is this also Math Olympiad? Philippine math, yeah, the same advice. Practice that. My prof, I think, helps out with the PMO. I'm not sure if he runs it, but he's also the coach for one of the teams. So yeah, just practice problem solving as opposed to rote exercises. In other words, you want to do problems, not mathematical exercises where you already know how to solve it and you just have to calculate the numbers correctly. Okay, people are not asking debate-related questions, so I will just move on. Okay, processing loss and victory. This is the last slide other than the Q&A slide. So I just want to give some advice. Again, lose honestly. Excuses are really for other people, and you must learn to either take as much as you can from the loss or really just enjoy the losses. Sometimes even if you lose a round, it's important to just take what you can from that speech and just make sure that you enjoyed giving the speech, even if that speech did not get you the win. It can at least be a speech that made you proud. So maybe you can lose in front of the judge and in the eyes of the judge and in the eyes of the crowd, but as long as you don't lose in your own eyes by giving a speech you're proud of, that's fine. Secondly, again, as I said, always possible to be unhappy with any result. So just understand how far that you've come. If you get to the finals of a tournament and your goal was to win, maybe it's like, sucks. It sucks that you have to do all this work and just to almost win it, but not actually win. It's still fine to have made the finals. It's still fun and it's still enjoyable and it's still an achievement that most people will not ever get. Even just breaking is quite good. Finishing a tournament all several rounds is something that still a lot of people haven't been able to do. Like just go through all 3 rounds of a tournament. That can be hard. But understand how far that you've come and how far that you're going to get in the next few months, in the next few years. Finally, is that winning can feel numb. I have won a lot of tournaments, and I will say that it never really feels as good as the first win. Like a lot of the time, winning is really just the relief that you didn't let down your teammates, or relief is just like, wow, at least people won't think I'm an idiot. or people don't think I was the reason the team lost because I'm pabuhat sa team, and I got carried here. Like winning can feel numb. Winning can just feel like relief, but not actual satisfaction or gratification at the success. So remind yourself to never let it go too far. Like if you're reaching this point, you are not enjoying debate anymore. You are basically just going through the motions and hoping that you get out the right outcome. Try and rediscover what makes you enjoy debate and what makes you love debate. Sometimes it can be rewatching a speech after you've been lost in the sauce for so many months. Rewatching a speech that makes you love debate, or a speech that you look up to, or even just trying out new stuff in debate. Maybe trying out jokes instead of just being serious all the time. Trying to run as many arguments as you can, even if it's not really practical. Winning can feel numb. So remind yourself to never let it go too far, and always make sure that debating at the end, while it's a sport where you want to do well in, it's also ultimately a game. And the point of a game is not just to give like accolades and to put in your CV, but also to enjoy and to inspire. Okay. That's all the advice I have for today. So if you have any questions, now's the time to ask them. If not, then I'll just sleep, and I'll go home and I'll sleep. Okay. Someone has asked me a long question. What are your ways of mentally conditioning / grounding yourself during a tournament, i.e., keeping your composure and or dealing with L's or W's, but at the same time still cooking and achieving the goals or expectations that you have? I usually have a problem of breaking down in the last rounds or the prelims, or in the very first out rounds, because it's an unusual way to regulate my emotions instead of bottling up. How do you cope with the mental toll of debate? Like I said, I just kind of remind myself, like, I've done this before. It's not a really big deal if I win or I lose. And I just have to try my hardest every time. And if I feel like I'm floating away, I ground myself with like the physical sensation of like being alive. Like I eat food or I shower. Uh, I think after the LIV finals, a bunch of us did push-ups, which I thought was pretty funny. So that's how you did it. Like, yeah, it was. We did push-ups, but the ground was really dirty in Makiving Gardens, so we had to wash up. But yeah, so just like you have your own ways. You'll have your own ways. For me, it's like the physical exertion. Like for my first Idea Light, we had something called the Hilo race where which was in, I think Idea Light was in LSGH or Savior School, and we put our heads to the ground and then we like spun around so that we were really dizzy, and then we had to run all the way to the other end of the field, and it was pretty fun. And it made me not think about, oh, I didn't do well. I only died in the quarterfinals, or I broke pretty low. But I wasn't focusing on that. I was focusing that, man, I'm having a moment I will remember from in years from now. Don't take debating as a sequence of rounds and a sequence of wins and losses. Take it as as it is, which is just something to be experienced. And in the end, the experience over, and you have to let it pass. Okay. How do I mental math statistics practice? Hi, David. How would you deal with being partnered with your significant other in a debate tournament in April? I think it's an awful idea. I think don't ever do that. Like, that's so awful. I mean, maybe it'll work out for you, but I think it's like, well, okay. Ali put a sad react. But if I recall correctly, so there were really moments in that ABP. um, but yeah, how if I had to be partnered with my significant other, I would just remember that there are things more important than doing well in debate, and try not to get too stressed out about like round results or your partner's speech or doing well, and just more focus on enjoying. Okay. Maybe give it like one more minute for questions, and then if not, I will head out. How do you motivate your fellow NC mates to debate? Well, for one, not everybody wants to debate, and that's fine. I think you have to accept that. But if you really wanted to motivate them to debate, one thing that really helped me get motivated to debate was sort of like the Michael Jordan or effect, or like the Kobe Bryant effect, where like you just see them training every day and putting in the work in the gym day in and day out. So you're like, fine, I guess I'll do a speech. and then I'll do a round, and then I'll do a couple more rounds, and right, and sometimes your energy can be infectious, so you just have to set a good example. I think if you're motivated to debate sufficiently, or you're motivated, then you just have to make sure that other people get caught up in your wave and feel the same energy for debate that you do. Someone asked if they could ask something about LIV Grand Finals. If it's fine, yeah, go ahead. How can you bounce between 2v2 with 3v3 tourneys without losing what you know about your preferred format? I think people make them seem a lot more different than they actually are. In reality, you're just applying different skills from different parts. And in reality, the only skill you need to retain is just do what you need to do to win. Like many skills are analogous or mappable. A whip speech is similar to a whip speech. A reply speech is similar to a whip speech. A depth speech is similar to a depth speech. The main difference is just 2v2, v2, v2 is mostly offensive, like you're attacking the other team, because you don't have to be perfectly solid on your own. You just have to be the least bad. And versus 3v3, where you have to really defend, like you have to make sure your team has something standing. Okay. Somebody asked if they could ask something, but oh, how did you do the speech after the POI without notes? Do you just remember the notes you put, or what is on the spot? After I got the POI, I was like, I should just make a different speech. So I just gave a different speech. I felt that after Bea gave the POI to me, and I had like such a convincing answer, I was like, this should be a bigger part of my speech. So I was like, my notes aren't gonna really be helpful, so I just did not look at it. Okay. Yeah, I guess if this is it, I think we should be good, right? Oh, my views do not reflect the views of the Ateneo Debate Society. If I mention any if any people or names, I'm mostly out of the circuit, so I don't care if people think my opinions are weird. How did we prepare during the grand finals about Worlds 2023? Curious of the Ubuntu motion. We saw it to just be a sort of a generic communitarianism motion versus individualism motion. We just prepared it like we normally do for those types of motions. Well, it's not really generic. It's like it's got a unique framing to it. But we had done this type of debate many times before. So we just sort of sat on the ground and then we just talked about our arguments. Like we didn't actually talk about building the arguments layer by layer because we had built these arguments many times before. We were just like, oh, okay, let's run this argument. Okay, I think this argument should have a preemption like this. Okay, sure. Let's build the second argument. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now I think Clarks can send us off, right?
Slay. Everyone say thank you, David. React or send a chat. Yay.
Bye,
Okay.
everyone.
So before you guys go, can you like turn on your camera so I can take a picture? This is for the ADS FB. Yeah, so I'll give you guys like a few seconds or maybe a minute to freshen up or whatever. Wait, guys, don't be here. Ayan,
Oh
guys.
wow, it's the Three Stooges.
Did he call us students? So I'm yeah, me, Jello, and Jello. Okay. Hi, I'm Largo. He's the second and he's Jello.
I hate you guys so much.
They all laugh the same.
Guys, sige na. Turn on your cameras. ADS feature. ADS soft launch. Come on. Ayan. Slay. Okay. Ay, may habol. Okay. May humabol. Wait lang. 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay, one more. 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay. Last reminder na lang, guys. Please fill up the feedback form. So, yeah. Go to the Discord and fill it up. Thank you, guys. See you during the debate rounds.